Beneath the wide-open skies of Wyoming, something ancient stirs. Not in the rivers, not in the wind, but deep in the stone, where time cracked open and forgot to close. Caves filled with vanished predators, fossils of animals that shouldn't be here, tools from hands no one remembers, and stories etched in rock and whispered in legend that science still can't explain. This isn't just history, it's what happens before history. Welcome to Wyoming, where the past didn't die. It just got buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. And now, we're digging. Before we descend any deeper into the ancient unknown, make sure you subscribe. This channel is your map to mysteries no one else dares to touch. And while we're here, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? What time is it as you listen? Because whether it's 3 a.m. in a quiet kitchen or sunset on the edge of nowhere, these stories have a way of finding you right on time. Natural trap cave, Ice Age fossils. It starts with a hole in the ground. Unassuming, circular, a little too perfect, like the earth tried to cover it up and gave up halfway. From the surface, you wouldn't guess anything except that it might swallow your dog or your sense of direction. But peer over the edge of Natural Trap Cave in northern Wyoming, and you're looking down a vertical shaft that drops over 80 feet into prehistoric silence. A limestone sinkhole, positioned almost maliciously on a migratory corridor, it has quietly harvested the clumsy and the unlucky for tens of thousands of years. Pleistocene animals, steppe bison, dire wolves, short-faced bears, mammoths, and yes, even the occasional saber-toothed cat all met the same fate. One moment they were walking, grazing, living. The next, gravity took over and did what gravity does best. Reminded them there are no do-overs when the ground disappears beneath you. Since the 1,970 seconds, this vertical tomb has surrendered its secrets slowly. Paleontologists first rappelled into the abyss like cautious grave robbers, finding a dense stratigraphy of bones stacked like forgotten pages of a book that shouldn't exist. Decades later, a new wave of scientists returned with better ropes, better funding, and better questions. But as is often the case with ancient Wyoming, the more precise the tools, the murkier the picture. Because something doesn't quite add up. Some of the species found at the bottom didn't exactly live together or shouldn't have. The bones suggest cohabitation of ecological niches that, according to modern understanding, should have kept these animals separated by geography, climate, or sheer temperament. Yet there they are, tangled together in sedimentary layers like they all RSVP to the same fatal invitation. Then there's the matter of timing. Some of the remains seem suspiciously out of sequence. Younger bones turn up lower than they should be, while older ones hang around near the top like they missed their cue. Initial theories about water washing bones around in seasonal floods don't explain the strange patterning completely. It's not quite chaos, but it also doesn't follow the expected choreography of death and decay. The mystery deepens with the mortality profiles. If this were just a kill site, you'd expect randomness. Instead, some species show peculiar clustering, a lot of juveniles here, only elderly individuals there. Predators are curiously underrepresented in some layers and oddly abundant in others. Did certain animals fall more often during specific seasons? Was it migration gone wrong? Or something stranger, a recurring environmental trap timed to confuse the instincts of even the most ancient survivors? As for the microenvironment, well, it resists categorization. Remnants of pollen and plant material are being reconstructed into elaborate climatic maps, but the full picture of Ice Age Wyoming oscillates like a broken thermostat. Was it alpine tundra? Grassland savanna? A frozen mosaic of both? The truth is probably inconvenient. It may have been everything and nothing like what we imagine. What's left behind are ghost signals, ambiguous data points that whisper of lost weather systems and vanishing ecosystems. And of course, there's the human question, or the conspicuous absence of it. So far, no definitive signs of human presence, no tools, no cut marks, No campfire smoke trapped in soil layers. But should we trust that silence? Paleoindian migration routes crisscross this region. Could some of these animals have been stalked? Could the cave itself have served as a deliberate trap rather than an accidental one? If so, it would be one of the oldest known engineered death pits on the continent, a chilling possibility hiding behind the bureaucratic term natural. The cave has more bones than answers, and more questions than most researchers want to admit. Every summer, scientists dangle themselves down on ropes like archaeologists of failure, extracting bits of jaw and femur from a subterranean filing cabinet no one remembers creating. They bring up samples, run isotopic analyses, take climate proxies, scan for ancient DNA, and get back ambiguity, noise, contradiction. It's as if the cave knows it's being interrogated and responds by coughing up just enough clarity to keep the funding coming. Science, of course, is patient. But Natural Trap Cave seems almost amused by the whole endeavor, a kind of prehistoric prank still playing out after 100,000 years. And the more we learn, the less it feels like a grave and more like a parable, about movement, misjudgment, and the kind of danger that waits patiently just off the well-trodden path. Because if a single sinkhole can preserve an entire Ice Age menagerie, what else is buried nearby that hasn't yet opened its mouth? Or worse, what happens when it does? 230-million-year-old early dinosaur fossil from Wyoming, Avaitum banduovich. In 2023, buried beneath layers of Triassic stone that hadn't felt daylight in over 200 million years, scientists stumbled upon something that shouldn't be in Wyoming, or at least, not yet. It was small, chicken-sized, bipedal. A little awkward, as most early dinosaurs were. But what caught paleontologists completely off guard wasn't just what it was, but when. Ahvaitum banduivche. The name, gifted by the northern Arapaho, means they come back, which is poetic, ironic, and mildly threatening all at once. Because this creature, this fragile, bird-like proto-dinosaur, wasn't supposed to be here. Not in Wyoming, not this early, and not looking quite like this. Before this fossil turned up in the Red Desert region, the prevailing theory was that dinosaurs originated in the southern hemisphere, Argentina, Brazil, maybe Madagascar, and spread outward slowly. Like very patient colonizers, North America was thought to be a later stage in the story, a kind of evolutionary after-party that the dinosaurs only stumbled into once they had their act together. But Aphytum politely smashes that narrative with its little bird-like foot. Dated to approximately 230 million years ago, around the same age as the earliest dinosaurs from South America, this Wyoming fossil suggests something disorienting. Either dinosaurs evolved in multiple places simultaneously, or the ones in the northern hemisphere got started a lot earlier than anyone realized and just stayed quiet about it. It's the prehistoric version of learning that jazz wasn't invented in New Orleans, but in some forgotten town in rural Montana. This isn't just about geographical bragging rights, it reshuffles the whole timeline. If Ahvaitum lived and died in Wyoming this early, then the migration theories, the evolutionary trees, the assumptions about continental drift and animal dispersal all have to bend a little or break entirely. It's a reminder that paleontology is less about writing history and more about constantly revising it under duress. What we know about Ahvaitum itself is, admittedly, modest. It was light-framed, likely fast-moving, with skeletal features that plant it firmly in the early stages of the dinosaur family tree, but not in any well-lit hallway. It's not quite a theropod, not quite a sauropodomorph. It's something between, a transitional form, evolutionary liminal space with legs, which makes it either a key missing link or an evolutionary dead end that just happened to leave behind a perfect calling card, a beautifully preserved skeleton, whispering, "You missed a chapter." Of course, this raises the question no one enjoys confronting in polite, academic circles. How many other fossils like this have been missed, mislabeled, or left unexcavated? For years, Triassic layers in Wyoming were treated like empty real estate barely worth the dig. The assumption was that nothing big or cinematic happened here until much later, when Jurassic giants like Diplodocus and Allosaurus strutted onto the stage. But if Tomb is any indication, the Triassic wasn't some slow preamble. It was already full of strange experiments, creatures testing out the dinosaur blueprint in quiet corners of the continent. Some would thrive. Some would vanish. But the evolutionary drama was already underway, and no one bothered to notify the textbooks. What's more unsettling is that the fossil's very survival seems accidental. The surrounding stone, fine-grained, oxidized, resistant to erosion, happened to be just right for preserving delicate bone. A few feet deeper or shallower, and the whole specimen could have been crushed, shattered, or worn into unrecognizable dust. It's not just that we almost didn't find it. It's that reality barely allowed it to exist in the first place. And still, even with the fossil in hand, the story refuses to solidify. Phylogenetic models, those glorified family trees, have trouble placing Tomb with confidence. Too many ancestral traits, not enough derived ones. It's like trying to classify a teenager who keeps changing their haircut mid-sentence. Some researchers want to call it a close cousin of Herrerasaurus. Others think it might be something entirely unique, a ghost lineage that lit up briefly and disappeared, leaving only a riddle behind. Either way, it reopens an awkward debate. If dinosaurs evolved earlier and in more places than previously thought, then how much else have we chronically underestimated? How many of our maps, those neat diagrams with arrows and migration paths, are really just wishful thinking pinned to outdated assumptions? For now, Tomb stands alone, quietly ruining what we thought we knew about the Triassic. Its name, They Come Back, could be taken literally. A comeback story, 230 million years in the making. But it's also a warning. History, especially deep time, is not a straight line. It folds, it misleads, it hides the good stuff at the bottom of the pile. And if Wyoming was once home to creatures like this long before the Jurassic parade began, what else is buried beneath its rust-colored deserts, waiting to rewrite the origin stories we thought were already carved in stone? Because somewhere, beneath even older layers, there might be fossils of creatures we don't even have names for yet. Creatures that didn't just live before the dinosaurs, they lived like they knew someone would find them. Eventually. If your mind's already racing with questions and we've only just brushed the surface, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Because somehow, these ancient stories always find their way to us when the hour's a little strange and the ground feels just a little too quiet. Triassic amphibians, discovered in a bone bed at Knobby Knob, Paleoindian bakery. They died together. That much seems clear. What's less clear is why a group of massive, flat-headed amphibians, each the size of a grown adult human, ended up piled in the same place. Buried in silence for 230 million years, beneath what is now a strangely named mound in central Wyoming, Knobby Knob. It sounds like a joke, or the setting of a children's cartoon, but it holds the kind of riddle that keeps paleontologists up at night. Because in this remote outcrop, dozens of fossilized skeletons of Paleoindian bakery, a creature that looks like evolution, once took a detour through a reptilian fever dream lie side by side, as if they decided on some collective departure nobody told the rest of the planet about. Paleoindian was no gentle frog. These were heavily built amphibians with broad, armor-like skulls, elongated bodies, and paddle-like limbs designed for water, but not incapable on land. They were survivors of a volatile Earth, living in a time when the continents were still trying to make up their minds about where to be. The Triassic world was unpredictable. Seasonal droughts, flash floods, erupting volcanoes, and a rapidly shifting cast of predators and prey. Yet these creatures thrived. For a while, then something happened. The Knobby Knob bone bed suggests a sudden, perhaps synchronized death event. And that's where the mystery begins, not with what they were, but but with how they all ended up here, preserved in sediment so finely layered that even delicate bones remained intact. No scavenging, no chaotic scattering, just the orderly stillness of time closing in. One theory is drought. In periods of extreme dryness, animals often gather around shrinking water sources, trapped by their own desperation. It's a poetic kind of cruelty. Survival drawing them closer, then finishing them off when the water finally vanishes. But the evidence at Knobby Knob resists this narrative. The surrounding sediment shows signs not of desiccation, but of flooding rapid deposition, perhaps from a sudden deluge or debris flow. If the drought theory was an easy answer, the rock layers politely decline. Another possibility? Volcanic ashfall. The Triassic wasn't exactly known for its stability. Volcanic activity during this time was frequent and moody. An eruption hundreds of miles away could send ash clouds drifting across the landscape, blanketing wetlands and rivers with suffocating layers of dust. Amphibians, with their sensitive skin and oxygen-hungry metabolisms, would have been especially vulnerable. A single night of ashfall could have ended them. But again, the local sediment doesn't scream volcano. There are no obvious ash beds, no chemical signatures, just mudstone, finely laminated, soft, and quiet. Then there's the more speculative angle, that these creatures were social, that they lived and died in groups. It sounds absurd at first. Amphibians today aren't exactly known for communal living outside of brief, explosive breeding seasons. But Buettneropedon wasn't a frog or a salamander. It was a temnospondyl, a lineage all its own. Maybe they moved in herds. Maybe they migrated together between wet and dry seasons. Maybe they nested in the same safe spots year after year until, one year, the place wasn't safe anymore. Of course, social behavior is the sort of phrase paleontologists use with caution. You can't exactly interview a fossil. You can only infer behavior from patterns, proximity, frequency, consistency. And Knobby Knob offers one pattern, not several. So whether this was a tragic accident, a natural gathering gone wrong, or something more intentional remains an open file. What elevates the mystery further is the quality of preservation. These are not shattered remains. Many of the skeletons are nearly complete, jaws intact, limbs splayed in lifelike positions. It's as if whatever ended their lives also froze the moment and place, which, scientifically, is invaluable and narratively a little unnerving, because sudden death on that scale implies power. A force strong enough not just to kill, but to preserve. Yet for all we have, the fossils, the sediment, the relative dating, we still can't quite say why. Knobby Knob feels like a message written in a language no one speaks anymore. One of those moments in prehistory where the script survives, but the meaning does not. A drama without subtitles. And then there's the broader question. Why here? Wyoming isn't where we typically expect to find fossil amphibian congregations from this era. Most Triassic finds of this kind are located in what used to be wetter, more equatorial environments. Texas, Germany, parts of India. What were these creatures doing so far north, in a landscape that seems to have been alternately dry, volatile, and prone to extreme shifts? Were they outliers, pioneers, refugees from some climatic event elsewhere? Their presence hints at something larger than just a freak accident. It suggests migration, environmental stress, and maybe even a story of expansion gone wrong. And so Knobby Knob remains, unassuming on the surface, deeply unresolved beneath. A quiet mound holding one of the more oddly poetic mysteries of prehistoric life. The idea that even in deep time, even among creatures long extinct, there may have been moments of shared existence, of gathering, of moving in sync before the earth decided otherwise. And if that gathering ended in sudden silence, it wouldn't be the last time Wyoming held on to a moment like that. After all, further back in the rock record, deeper, older, stranger, there are fossils of something cold-blooded, coiled together, buried side by side like they were huddling for something. Warmth, Maybe. Or warning. The winter serpents snakes huddled together 38 million years ago. You don't usually think of snakes as communal creatures. They're solitary by reputation and by design. Silent, cold-blooded, and emotionally unavailable even by reptile standards. But somewhere in southwestern Wyoming, roughly 38 million years ago, 3 snakes decided to break the mold. They didn't just die near each other, they died with each other. Their fossilized remains were discovered coiled together, their bodies delicately intertwined in a sandstone slab from the Eocene epoch, preserved in a moment so improbable that it reads like a setup. 3 serpents, 1 death scene, no context. Their position was so intimate, so coordinated, that researchers nicknamed them the winter serpents. And ever since, the question has lingered like cold breath on glass. What were they doing? The textbook explanation, always the first on the table, is overwintering. Reptiles are ectothermic, meaning their body temperature depends on the environment, and when things get cold, they don't fight it. They slow down, they hide. In modern times, certain snake species will huddle together in dens during winter months to conserve what little warmth the earth can offer. This behavior is known, observed, and practical. But this fossil isn't modern, it's 38 million years old. And the rock it was found in doesn't exactly scream hibernation chamber. The sediment suggests a relatively warm, possibly subtropical climate during the Eocene, with lush forests, wet lowlands, and a menagerie of ancient mammals, birds, and reptiles, all vying for space. So, if the snakes were trying to avoid freezing, they were doing it in a world that wasn't supposed to freeze. Unless, of course, it did suddenly, and just for long enough. That's the first curveball. The second, these snakes weren't all from the same species, at least not conclusively. The morphology suggests close relatives, but not identical. That adds a layer of intrigue. Did these reptiles have enough in common behaviorally or environmentally to share a burrow during harsh times? Or were they simply caught in the same trap, converging by coincidence? Some paleontologists have proposed that the snakes may have been sharing a nesting or molting space. Perhaps it was a temporary shelter, a hollow log, a patch of loose soil, or a warm spot near a geothermal vent that became a death trap. Others suggest a predator event. Maybe something disturbed them, forced them underground, and whatever that was, it buried them before they could untangle. But again, the evidence refuses to commit. There are no clear signs of trauma, no obvious predator tooth marks, no panicked scattering of bones. Their bodies remained intact, graceful even, like they laid down and drifted into stasis. The sandstone preserved not only their form but the spatial relationship between them, as if the earth wanted us to see exactly how they died, but not why. This is where things take a more philosophical turn, because behavior rarely fossilizes. We can interpret movement from footprints, infer diets from teeth, guess at migration from isotopes, but a group cuddle? That's not the kind of thing bones usually tell you. So when we find something like the winter serpents, we project. We search for patterns in modern analogs. We ask whether this is a glimpse of sociality, an emotional artifact in cold stone. Did these animals exhibit proto-social behavior, the kind that would eventually evolve in more complex vertebrates? Or are we just mistaking spatial coincidence for something warmer? Even the naming winter serpents suggests a human need to assign story, to wrap a biological unknown in a seasonal metaphor. It's poetic, it's marketable, it's a soft narrative in a harsh geologic record. But what if it's also true? What if long before mammals took over the intimacy business, certain reptiles already understood the value of proximity? There's also the haunting possibility that this isn't a window into community, but a glimpse of a shared ending, an environmental event, a sudden landslide, a release of underground gases, a cold snap out of nowhere, something rapid enough to entomb them as they lay, untouched, undisturbed, undecayed. Or maybe they weren't hiding. Maybe they were born there. Maybe it was a nesting site, and the snakes were siblings. Maybe they never knew another world outside the small hollow where they died. The fossil doesn't clarify it, only records. Which leaves us with the unsettling conclusion that for all our knowledge, some of the most ancient behaviors remain out of reach. We can name the species, estimate the age, reconstruct the biome in 3D models and peer-reviewed journals, but we can't answer the simplest question: why did these snakes choose to be together? Were they cold? Were they scared? Were they simply there? The winter serpents sit at the edge of what paleontology can know. Their stillness is not silence, it's defiance, a frozen contradiction of what reptiles are supposed to be. And in that contradiction, we're forced to consider what other behaviors might be missing from the fossil record, not because they didn't happen, but because we stopped looking for them. Because if snakes could huddle for warmth 38 million years ago, then maybe we're not the first creatures who needed someone beside us when things got cold. And if that's true, what else in prehistoric Wyoming was never as solitary as we assumed? Pedro Mountain, divided by San Pedro Mountains, Mummy, Pedro, and Chiquita. In 1932, two prospectors were poking around a remote gulch in the San Pedro Mountains of Wyoming when they blasted open a small cave. What they expected to find, if anything, was gold. What they did find was a human body, seated, desiccated, and just over a foot tall. If you're thinking that sounds like the setup to a folktale, you're not wrong. In fact, that's exactly how the story has often been treated, as half mystery, half mythology. But the mummy, nicknamed Pedro, was real. He was photographed, examined, displayed, shipped around, debated in newspapers and bars and medical conferences. For a brief moment in American history, the Pedro Mountain mummy wasn't just an oddity, he was a headline. And then, like most inconvenient artifacts, he disappeared. But let's rewind. The original discovery site was described as a small, sealed cave with a single chamber only about 4 feet wide and as many high. Inside, the mummy was found sitting cross-legged on a shelf-like ledge. His arms were folded neatly in his lap. His face, though shriveled, was expressive. Lips drawn back, teeth exposed, nose flattened. The whole body was dark brown and tightly compressed, like it had been freeze-dried by time itself. Initial estimates pegged his height at around 14 inches in his seated position. Had he stood upright, he may have topped out at around 36 inches, maybe less, but he wouldn't have stood for long. X-rays taken later showed that his bones were heavily ossified, his skull unusually thick, and internal organs, yes, even the brain remarkably well preserved, albeit shrunken. Now, here's where the story gets messy. The first wave of medical opinion declared the mummy to be a fully grown adult, despite the tiny stature. Some researchers pointed to the wear on the teeth, the proportion of the limbs, and the general bone structure as evidence that this was not a child or fetus, but a mature human, just one who happened to be very small and malformed. Others disagreed. The mummy, they argued, was an infant with anencephaly, a severe birth defect, but even that diagnosis couldn't explain everything. The teeth, for instance, looked worn in a way that suggested prolonged use. The ossification of the bones was unusually advanced. And then there was the matter of his location, sealed inside a cave, alone in a burial pose that looked deliberate. Then came the folklore. Long before Pedro was unearthed, stories circulated among native tribes, particularly the Shoshone and Crow of a race of little people who lived in the mountains. Known by names like the Nimaragar, these beings were said to be small in stature, fierce in temperament, and capable of magic. The tales described them as both protectors and punishers, capable of great wisdom or terrible violence, depending on the moral tone of the storyteller. In some versions of the legend, the little people were real, a diminutive tribe that once lived in the highlands and eventually vanished. In others, they were symbolic, a warning. a metaphor for the dangers of pride, trespass, or forgetting the old ways. When Pedro surfaced, people connected the dots. Too quickly, perhaps, but the cultural impact was immediate. A mummy in the mountains? That's folklore made flesh. But here's the real mystery. Pedro is gone. After a few years of circulation displayed at sideshows, studied by local scientists, passed between collectors, he vanished from public record. Some say he ended up in the hands of a private collector. Others claim he was destroyed. A few optimists believe he's sitting in a dusty storage unit somewhere, misfiled under miscellaneous. His absence only fuels speculation. And then, as if to complicate matters further, there came reports of a second mummy nicknamed Chiquita, discovered under vaguely similar circumstances, and likewise lost. Together, Pedro and Chiquita form a pair of ghost artifacts, tangible enough to have been photographed, examined, and remembered, but intangible enough to never be conclusively explained. Were they simply tragic cases of rare genetic deformities? Possibly. But if that's the case, they're still anomalies, unusually well preserved, unusually situated, and unusually connected to persistent regional folklore. Scientific explanations exist, but they don't close the case, they just push the ambiguity in a more palatable direction. Because there's something uneasy about Pedro's story. It straddles categories we prefer to keep separate: history and myth, medicine and mystery, science and superstition. We want clean boxes. We want him to be either a hoax, a rare medical case, or an ancient ritual, but he refuses to be just one thing. Instead, Pedro becomes a placeholder, a symbol for everything we suspect might be lurking just out of reach in the archaeological record. Not aliens, not monsters, not fantasy, but fragments. Lives too small to leave a legacy, too strange to be absorbed into the mainstream narrative, and too delicate to survive both time and skepticism. And if Pedro really is gone, if no one knows where he is, or whether he still exists at all, then he's more powerful than ever. Because now he's a story, and stories don't decay. They echo. Echo through mountains, through caves, through names carved in stone, through warnings half remembered by grandmothers and tribal elders and weathered storytellers. Because if Pedro was real, and Chiquita was too, how many others never made it to the surface? And if there was once a culture of little people living in the mountains of Wyoming, short-lived, misunderstood, erased by time, what else have we mistaken for myth that was only ever waiting to be dug up? Petroglyphs at Castle Gardens. Out in the dry, sun-bleached stillness of central Wyoming, where the wind wears the rock down into strange silhouettes and the ground seems to crackle underfoot with old tension, there's a place called Castle Gardens, a name that sounds like a fantasy, verdant, ornate, filled with roses or ruin. But there are no gardens here, and no castle either. Just sandstone, sky, and silence. And on the rock walls, carved into the past with a patience that borders on obsessive, are dozens of petroglyphs figures etched in stone that don't ask for interpretation so much as dare you to try. They are not the oldest rock art in the world. They are not the largest, but they are different. These aren't just handprints or abstract spirals. Many of the Castle Gardens images belong to a style known as Castle Gardens shield style, a term that describes the dominant motif found here: anthropomorphic figures holding large, rounded shields. Some of them are etched with intricate internal patterns, grids, dots, zigzags, concentric rings. Others appear more worn, fading into the rock as if erasing themselves on purpose. And here's where the mystery begins. Because while many petroglyph styles in the American West have reasonably well-defined cultural affiliations, Fremont, Ancestral Puebloan, Dinwoody, etc., the Castle Gardens shield style doesn't quite match any of them. Its creators remain anonymous. The exact age is debated, but estimates place them somewhere between 1,000 and 1,000 500 years old, right in the middle of a cultural no man's land in the archaeological record, a transitional period. A time when groups moved, borders blurred, and identities were anything but fixed. In short, a perfect time for ambiguity. What makes these images especially puzzling is the combination of precision and abstraction. The shields are drawn with great care, symmetrical, deliberate, sometimes almost mathematical. But the figures holding them? They're stylized to the point of surrealism. No two are alike. Some have broad torsos and thin arms, others are squat, geometric, almost robotic. A few appear to have horns or antennae, while others seem to float without legs, as if the idea of a body was optional. These were not casual doodles. They were statements, rituals, or warnings. And we don't know who made them. Some scholars link them to the Athabascan-speaking ancestors of modern-day Apache or Navajo. Others believe they were crafted by ancestors of the Shoshone or other Great Basin peoples. Still others suggest that they reflect a fusion art produced in a time of contact, conflict, or cohabitation between different cultural groups. The shields themselves hint at warfare, or at least the theater of warfare, but the lack of accompanying weaponry or battle scenes complicates the picture. It's like being shown a row of knights, but no dragons. Some researchers believe the shields may not be literal at all. They could be spiritual emblems, totems, visions from trance states. The fact that the same motifs appear across different petroglyph sites in Wyoming and Montana suggests a shared iconography, like a cultural language that stretched across miles, but not necessarily across centuries. It could have been a secret code, or a public mural, a religious act, or a political one, or both. Even the placement of the petroglyphs feels intentional. Castle Gardens is remote, difficult to reach even with modern roads. It's elevated, exposed, and windy. Not the kind of place you casually hang out and chip away at rock for fun. This was chosen. The figures face outward, almost confrontational, as if they were meant to be seen from a distance. Or by someone specific. Maybe other tribes. Maybe spirits. Maybe the land itself. Then there's the matter of the missing pieces. Over the years, vandalism and weathering have damaged many of the panels. Names scratched over figures, chunks broken off and hauled away. Some of the most intricate designs have been reduced to fragments. The damage is irreversible, but it also becomes part of the mystery. What don't we see? What meanings have been lost, not just to time, but to deliberate erasure? And what does it say about us that we keep repeating the erasure, over and over again, century after century? In more recent years, digital documentation and preservation efforts have been ramped up. High-resolution scans, photogrammetry, even 3D modeling. But even with all this technology, the central questions remain as elusive as ever. Who were they? What were they trying to say? And why here, at this wind-scarred outcropping in the middle of nowhere? Some think the petroglyphs were a map, others, a form of spiritual bookkeeping. A few suggest they were a kind of psychological armor, projecting strength in a time of social collapse or environmental stress. And then there's the more unnerving possibility that these weren't meant for us at all, that their message wasn't preserved for posterity, but intended to vanish sacred graffiti meant only for the moment. Either way, Castle Gardens stands as a fossil of thought carved into the bone of the earth, but stripped of its context. A conversation with no speaker, a riddle with no punchline. And just a few miles away, in a different part of Wyoming entirely, there's another wall of stone, covered in different petroglyphs, older, stranger, and even less understood. Because if Castle Gardens was a message left in the wind, then what exactly was drawn at Legend Rock, and why does it feel like it's looking back? Legend. Rock petroglyphs. There's a stretch of sandstone in Hot Springs County, Wyoming, that holds more questions than any academic conference room could hope to answer. It's not especially large. It's not particularly isolated. You could drive past it on your way to something more glamorous, like the steaming pools of Thermopolis, and never realize you just passed through one of the most haunting open-air archives in North America. It's called Legend Rock, and if Castle Gardens feels like a coded message carved into stone, then Legend Rock is something closer to a fever dream, or a confession. Spanning nearly 400 feet of weathered cliffside, this site contains more than 300 petroglyphs, many of which belong to a style known as Dinwoodie, an artistic tradition unique to central Wyoming and still largely undeciphered. The figures are mostly humanoid, or at least, they start that way. Elongated torsos, disproportionately large heads, insect-like eyes, strange appendages where arms should be. They're often surrounded by what look like rays, antennae, or concentric halos, as if they're broadcasting something, or receiving it. And these are not sketches. These are deeply carved, with stone tools, into solid rock. Hours of labor for each figure. Days, maybe weeks, devoted to one shape. There's reverence here, but also obsession. Whoever made these images wasn't just decorating the walls, they were documenting something. Or trying to. But what? Here's where the ground starts to shift beneath your feet. No one knows exactly how old the petroglyphs are. Some estimates place the earliest figures at 10,000 years old, while others argue for a more conservative window of 1,000 to 3,000 years. Radiocarbon dating doesn't apply to stone carvings, so archaeologists must rely on indirect evidence: the patina of the rock surface, the depth of the carving, the degree of erosion. It's imprecise, aggravating, and strangely fitting for a site that resists clarity on every level. Unlike other rock art styles that feature animals, hunting scenes, or domestic life, the figures at Legend Rock are relentlessly abstract. They don't tell a story in any conventional sense. There's no obvious sequence, no narrative thread to follow. It's as if the people who carved them weren't trying to depict life, but something else entirely, something internal, or spiritual, or possibly not human at all. This has, predictably, attracted a variety of interpretations, some academic, others less so. The conservative scholarly position is that these figures are part of a visionary tradition. That is, they represent the images seen during trance states, possibly induced by fasting, isolation, or ritual use of hallucinogenic plants. In this view, Legend Rock becomes a kind of prehistoric neurological scan, a record of what it looks like when a human mind breaks through to something else. Not aliens, not monsters, not gods, necessarily. Just the raw, unfiltered geometry of altered consciousness. But then again, some of the carvings do look deliberate. Not random, not chaotic. They repeat. Certain motifs, spoked circles, serpentine lines, radiating patterns show up over and over, not just here, but in other Dinwoodie sites miles away. It's hard not to wonder, if this was all just hallucination, why are the visions so consistent? And why are the eyes always watching? The figures at Legend Rock don't avert their gaze. They don't look away. They stare directly, unapologetically. Some have multiple sets of eyes. Some have no mouths. Some appear to be mid-transformation, with bodies halfway between forms. Human? Animal? Spirit? You're never sure. And just when you think you've found a pattern, the style shifts. Newer figures overlap older ones. Some are scratched out, others half-finished. There are layers here not just of time, but of meaning. Corrections, revisions, censorship, no one knows. What complicates matters even more is the lack of nearby settlement evidence. Unlike places such as Mummy Cave or High-Rise Village, Legend Rock doesn't appear to have been a domestic or campsite. There are no midden piles, no tools, no fire pits, just the wall, the art, and the wind. This suggests it was a destination, a place you traveled to, not through. A pilgrimage site, perhaps, a ceremonial waypoint, or something more cautionary. The figures don't exactly radiate peace. They seem burdened, alert, tense. Some clutch objects, staffs, shields, or other unknown items. Others appear to be mid-gesture, arms outstretched like they're holding something invisible, or warding it off. Tribal oral histories, particularly among the Shoshone, do offer some possible interpretations. The Dinwoody style is sometimes linked to ancestral spirits, protectors, or beings that existed before the current human age. In this reading, Legend Rock becomes a spiritual archive, a record not of events, but presences. And the artists weren't just making images, they were invoking them. But of course, much of that knowledge has been lost, fragmented, or held privately by those with good reason not to share it. After centuries of forced displacement, cultural erasure, and academic overreach, it's no surprise that some stories stay closed. So the carvings remain, silent, unread, familiar enough to seem almost understandable, but strange enough to stay out of reach. You can trace their outlines with your fingers. You can photograph them, model them, enter them into digital archives, but the moment you try to assign meaning, the rock pushes back, not like a wall, but like a mirror. And maybe that's the point. Because what if Legend Rock was never meant to tell us something? What if it was built to make us ask? And if these figures are staring back at us now, across centuries of erosion and confusion, what exactly do they see? Somewhere beyond the carvings, up in the Alpine shadow of the Wind River Range, there's evidence of ancient people living far above the tree line, in places no one should have been able to survive. And yet, they did. High-rise village divided by Alpine human occupation. Nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, tucked into the ragged spine of Wyoming's Wind River Range, lies a place so improbable that its very existence rewrites the rules of ancient human habitation in North America. This isn't just a campsite. It's not a temporary stopover. It's a village, perched at the kind of altitude where modern visitors struggle to breathe, and winter still arrives with the patience of a predator. They call it High-Rise Village, a name that feels like a punchline until you realize it's not ironic. It's descriptive. A sprawling scatter of ancient lodge pads, hearths, tools, and charcoal layers built high in the Alpine timberline, where the air is thin, the winters are long, and survival is supposed to be a seasonal negotiation. But here's the twist. The people who lived here weren't just passing through. They stayed. Archaeological excavations over the last 2 decades have revealed more than 60 lodge pads, some stacked atop one another like generational footprints, evidence of repeated, sustained occupation going back as far as 9,000 years ago. That's older than the pyramids, older than written language, older than most of what we think we know about how ancient peoples moved through the continent after the Ice Age. And yet, High-Rise Village isn't unique. It's just the best documented example of a broader pattern. Dozens of alpine sites now dot the Wind River Range and other high elevations throughout Wyoming. Once dismissed as flukes, or the product of short-term hunting trips, these sites are being re-evaluated. And they're telling a very different story about where ancient people chose to live, and more importantly, why. Let's start with the obvious question. How? High-altitude living isn't easy. Oxygen levels drop, growing seasons are short, winters are brutal, and even in summer, the weather can pivot from sunny to apocalyptic in under 10 minutes. In the modern era, with insulated gear and satellite communication, the Wind River Alpine Zone is still considered a place you visit, not a place you inhabit. But 9,000 years ago, people weren't just inhabiting it, they were thriving. Artifacts tell the tale. Stone tools made from obsidian sourced across hundreds of miles. Hearths layered with charred plant remains. Animal bones from highland species like marmots, mountain sheep, and pine squirrels. Even ancient pine nuts likely gathered and roasted suggest that people weren't just surviving, they were optimizing. They knew when the seeds would ripen. They knew where the game would migrate. They built structures with stone foundations and semi-permanent floors, not tents. not lean-tos. Homes. This wasn't a detour. It was a decision. And that decision baffles modern researchers because it challenges the dominant narrative of post-Pleistocene life, that people moved seasonally between lowland winter camps and highland summer hunting zones, always choosing convenience, always chasing abundance. High-rise village doesn't follow that logic. It hints at a culture adapted not just to elevation, but to complex alpine economies where food, shelter, and spiritual practice were tied to the rhythms of the high peaks, not the valleys below. There's evidence of long-term land management tree ring studies suggesting controlled burns to promote nut and game yields, the kind of ecological manipulation that implies deep knowledge and deeper roots. This wasn't a place you stumble upon and use once. This was generational, which raises an unsettling possibility. Maybe we've been underestimating ancient mobility, not because it was rare, but because it left fewer clues in the places we bother to look. For decades, archaeologists focused on the lowlands, assuming people would too. But what if the mountains held not just resources, but identity? And here's where the mystery blooms. Why here? Why choose a place where every survival instinct says no? Was it about safety? Higher elevations are harder to reach, easier to defend, and less crowded. Were these mountain dwellers escaping something or someone? Were they refugees from the valley wars, cultural outliers, or early environmentalists looking for cooler temperatures as the world began to warm? Or was the high country sacred? Some researchers believe spiritual or ceremonial motivations played a role. The Wind River Range has long been considered sacred by Shoshone and other indigenous groups. Maybe High-Rise Village wasn't just practical, it was pilgrimage, a place where living closer to the sky wasn't metaphor, but mandate. And then there's the timing. The earliest occupations of High-Rise Village coincide with the Holocene climatic optimum, a warm period around 8,000 years ago, when global temperatures were significantly higher. The lowlands may have been hot, dry, and unpredictable. The Alpine zones? Cooler, wetter, and biologically rich. So maybe these weren't mavericks, they were climate strategists. People who looked up and saw, not isolation, but opportunity. Still, many questions linger. Were these sites year-round or seasonal? Some evidence suggests seasonal use pine nuts and squirrel caches line up with late summer and fall. But the architecture hints at longer stays. Was there a cycle we don't fully understand? Did families rotate through, or did some stay year-round? Were these communities isolated, or part of a broader network of alpine sites with trade, communication, and shared rituals? No one knows for sure. What's clear is that the stereotype of ancient people living exclusively in valley bottoms, always following the game, always fleeing the snow, doesn't hold up. The mountains weren't a barrier, they were a blueprint, and the people who followed it left behind a legacy of innovation, adaptation, and quiet defiance. And if we almost missed them, if their stories were nearly erased simply because we weren't looking high enough, what else are we overlooking? Because nestled even deeper in Wyoming's terrain, beneath weathered rock and layers of iron ore, lies a site that may push the boundaries of human presence in North America even further back. And it begins with a sunrise Paleoindian site, in the rolling hills of southeastern Wyoming, not far from the now-defunct copper mines of the town of Sunrise, lies a site that, if interpreted correctly, might rewrite everything we thought we knew about the peopling of North America. No dramatic cliffs here, no petroglyph-covered canyons or frozen death traps. Just a scatter of stone tools embedded in the dirt, lying quietly beneath the weight of thousands of years and thousands of assumptions. This is the Sunrise Paleoindian site, and while it lacks the visual drama of other archaeological wonders, its implications are far louder than its surroundings suggest. The basics are deceptively simple. In and around the former mining operation, archaeologists discovered a scattering of chipped stone tools, projectile points, blades, scrapers buried beneath layers of soil that, by all available data, seem to date back at least 14,000 years and possibly even earlier. This pushes the site into a time frame that predates the widespread Clovis culture, long considered the benchmark for the earliest human presence on the continent. For decades, the Clovis first model dominated archaeological thinking. Clovis people, with their distinct fluted projectile points and big game hunting lifestyle, were believed to be the first to cross the Bering Land Bridge and spread rapidly across North America around 13,000 years ago. But Sunrise doesn't quite fit that picture. Its tools are older, the style's a little different. Not wildly different, there's continuity, but just enough to suggest a more complicated, layered story of early human arrival. The implication is that there may have been people here, right here, in Wyoming before Clovis. And if that's true, the entire map of early migration starts to wobble. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The site is fragmentary. The tool scatter is limited. The context is messy, literally because most of it was disrupted by 20th century mining operations. Huge swaths of land were blasted, bulldozed, and reshaped to extract copper ore long before anyone realized they might be destroying something far more valuable. As a result, the archaeological record at Sunrise is like a puzzle that's already missing half the pieces, and no one told you what the picture on the box was supposed to be. This makes stratigraphy the holy grail of archaeological interpretation, nearly impossible. Layers are mixed, surfaces disturbed. It's like trying to read a burnt book through a kaleidoscope. But some pieces survived, enough to suggest that this wasn't just a single-use hunting camp. The density and variety of tools imply repeat occupation, or perhaps a long-term seasonal encampment. Yet the real mystery isn't what's been found. It's what hasn't. Despite the artifacts, archaeologists have yet to locate the main camp, the central living area, the hearths, the shelters, the garbage pits, the bones that would tie the tools to meals, rituals, or human remains. Without that core evidence, the site remains tantalizingly incomplete. It's like finding someone's toothbrush and car keys, but no house. And yet, it's enough. Enough to force a reckoning with how we've interpreted the archaeological timeline in the Americas. Because if pre-Clovis people were here, making tools, surviving, adapting, it means the story is far older and more regional than previously thought. It means people didn't just pour across the continent in a single wave. They trickled, paused, split, converged, adapted. Some stayed high in the mountains. Others worked their way through river corridors and high plains. Sunrise suggests a version of the past that's decentralized, fragmented, and deeply human. And then there's the irony. The site sits in a place named Sunrise, but the copper mine that nearly erased it was all about digging down both literally and figuratively. In a rush for industrial progress, something older and arguably more meaningful was nearly lost. And even now, as archaeologists scramble to make sense of the fragments, the full story remains buried, not just under soil and rubble, but under institutional hesitation. Why? Because pre-Clovis evidence has a habit of causing academic headaches. It's disruptive. It asks scientists to re-examine data, rewrite timelines, and let go of neat origin stories. It's controversial not because it's implausible, but because it's inconvenient. And yet, the inconvenient truths tend to be the most revealing. The Sunrise site is one of several across North America, along with Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, Cactus Hill in Virginia, and Monte Verde in Chile, that hint at a deeper, more complex settlement history. One where people may have arrived not just earlier, but differently. By land, by sea, by routes we haven't even considered yet. For now, Sunrise remains a site with more questions than answers, but it is also a reminder. Sometimes the most important chapters in history don't come from dramatic discoveries. They come from quiet contradictions, from a stone tool lying just a little too deep, from a sediment layer that doesn't quite match the model, from a camp we haven't found, but know must exist somewhere, under our feet. Because if people were living in Wyoming 14,000 years ago, in the shadow of future mines, what else were they building? What other stories are hidden beneath the sediment waiting, as always, for us to realize we've been walking on them all along? And speaking of walking miles from sunrise, in lands that would have once teemed with giants, there's a site where everything was walking, and running, and falling, together. Hansen Ranch Bone Bed. The thing about mass death is that it rarely leaves the scene quietly, especially not when it involves dozens, maybe hundreds of creatures the size of school buses. And yet, deep in the rolling badlands of eastern Wyoming, the Hansen Ranch Bone Bed tells a strangely quiet story, a whisper of extinction. A fossilized moment when an entire group of dinosaurs either died together or were gathered by forces larger than themselves and then sealed into stone for eternity. This site, not far from the more famous Lance Formation, has become one of the richest Edmontosaurus bone beds in North America. Edmontosaurus, for the record, was a hadrosaur, a duck-billed herbivore roughly 30 feet long and weighing as much as 4 tons. They were the cattle of the late Cretaceous, numerous, relatively defenseless, and perpetually on edge about something eating them. Think giant prehistoric moose with social anxiety. At Hansen Ranch, their bones are everywhere. Not sprinkled, not scattered, stacked, layered, interlocked. Like a jigsaw puzzle someone tried to solve in a panic and then abandoned halfway through. Some skeletons are complete, others partial. Skulls are found resting inches from limb bones, ribs curled like parentheses around nothing. The bones are disarticulated but not destroyed, suggesting the animals didn't all rot in place, but they also weren't dragged far. Whatever happened, it was fast, it was specific, and it doesn't make sense. Because the real mystery at Hansen Ranch isn't that dinosaurs died, it's how they all ended up here, in one spot, in such vast numbers. One theory is flood transport. Seasonal rains or catastrophic storms could have swept carcasses downstream, collecting them in a natural basin. That would explain the jumbled nature of the remains and the overlapping layers. But if that's the case, then where are the other species? Why are the remains almost entirely Edmontosaurus, with only a handful of other animals, small predators, turtles, isolated theropod teeth found in the mix? A flood should have carried everything, not just one genus. Another hypothesis: this was a watering hole turned death trap, a place where herds gathered during droughts, only to be undone by scarcity. But again, the geological record at Hansen Ranch doesn't quite support that. There's no evidence of desiccation cracks, no clear sediment signature of a drying lake. The site isn't consistent with slow attritional deaths. It suggests a single event, or perhaps a series of rapid ones. Could it have been a volcanic ash fall? There's precedent. In other fossil beds like those in Montana and Alberta, volcanic layers have entombed animals in situ, but no ash bed has been definitively identified here. And while the late Cretaceous was volatile, the regional stratigraphy doesn't show the kind of thick tephra deposits you'd expect from that kind of event. Some paleontologists suggest disease, that a herd of Edmontosaurs might have fallen victim to an outbreak botulism, anthrax, something fast-acting and brutal. But again, that doesn't explain the logistics of the preservation. Disease scatters carcasses, the bodies decay, fall apart, get scavenged. Hansen Ranch doesn't look like a disease site. It looks like choreography gone wrong. So perhaps the most unsettling theory is the simplest. This was a mass death site, but we don't know what killed them. Not yet. The work being done here, meticulous excavation, bone-by-bone analysis, stratigraphic mapping, is ongoing, and every year it gets more complicated. Different death horizons, subtle sediment shifts, variation in bone weathering. Some specimens show signs of trampling, others appear untouched. It's like the site is telling multiple stories at once, and no one has figured out which one is the original. There's also a weird age distribution in the remains. The majority of the skeletons appear to be juveniles and subadults, not infants, not full-grown adults. In modern ecosystems, this kind of demographic skew can hint at social structure. Maybe the young formed separate herds, or traveled together seasonally. Or maybe, like teenagers of every species, they wandered somewhere they shouldn't have. And paid for it. But again, why here? Why them? And why all at once? The Hansen Ranch bone bed is part of a broader late Cretaceous story in Wyoming, a tale of shifting coastlines, rising sea levels, and a dying world that didn't know it was dying yet. This was near the end. Just a few million years before the asteroid. And yet, the fossil record from sites like this suggests an ecosystem still pulsing with life, still full of movement, still going about its business, until something stopped it. That something is still unnamed. It might have been water, wind, disease, earth, or bad luck, but whatever it was, it left behind a graveyard disguised as a puzzle. And the puzzle, to this day, remains unfinished. Because if Hansen Ranch is any indication, Wyoming isn't just where dinosaurs lived, it's where they died, en masse, in ways that still don't fit our tidy extinction narratives. And not far from this mass of bone and silence lies another fossil treasure, one that doesn't just preserve death, but life in almost photographic detail. And under those layers of ancient lakebed shale, something impossibly delicate has been waiting, with feathers, with scales, with skin. Green River Formation fossils. Beneath the sun-baked plains and eroded ridges of southwestern Wyoming lies a slab of rock so rich, so absurdly packed with life, that it's hard to look at it without wondering if nature was showing off. This is the Green River Formation, a stretch of ancient lakebed sediments spanning parts of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, but with its richest, most eerily preserved treasures buried beneath Wyoming's sagebrush and silence. If the Hansen Ranch bone bed is a graveyard, then the Green River Formation is a snapshot, a frozen moment. Not of a single species or a catastrophic event, but of entire ecosystems, captured in shale as thin as paper, layered neatly like the pages of a book the Earth accidentally wrote and then forgot to bind. We're talking about fossil fish. Sure, Naitia, the ubiquitous herring-like staple that appears in souvenir shops and museum displays worldwide. But also birds, turtles, crocodiles, bats, frogs, even primates, their tiny bones curled in lifelike postures, fingers still flexed, tails intact, a few feathers, here and there, so fine they defy reason. Leaves so delicate that you can still see the veins. Insects with translucent wings posed like they just landed. It's not just fossils, it's staging. As if nature paused mid-performance and the curtain never fell. The Green River Formation dates to the early Eocene epoch, about 48 to 53 million years ago, a time when the global climate was warm, sea levels were high, and Wyoming, believe it or not, was a lush, subtropical landscape dominated by vast freshwater lakes. These lakes, Fossil Lake, Lake Gosiute, and Lake Uinta, acted as the backdrop for a slow, silent drama of life, death, and accidental preservation. And that's where the first mystery begins. Why is the preservation so good? Most fossil beds give you bones. If you're lucky, maybe a few teeth. But Green River gives you soft tissue, skin impressions, intact organs, even stomach contents. It's the kind of preservation usually reserved for amber or permafrost, and yet here it is in plain old sedimentary rock. The prevailing theory is that the lakes were stratified, divided into oxygen-rich upper layers and oxygen-depleted lower ones. Anything that sank below a certain depth entered a chemical dead zone. No oxygen, no bacteria, no scavengers, just stillness. That explains the how, maybe, but not the why. Because not all layers show this level of preservation. Some parts of the formation are chaotic, full of broken bones and scattered remains. Others are flawless, almost surgical. What made certain layers so pristine? Seasonal variation? Algal blooms? Subtle shifts in water chemistry? The truth is, We still don't know. And that's the frustrating beauty of Green River. The rules keep changing with every new excavation. Another curiosity: species exclusivity. Some fish fossils occur only in certain layers. Some birds, like the stunning, long-extinct Presbyornis, a duck-like wader with flamingo legs, show up once and vanish entirely. A single bat species appears in one quarry and nowhere else. This suggests rapid environmental shifts, possibly climate-driven, happening on scales we're only beginning to understand. Then there's the issue of what's missing. For all the detail, certain expected species are rare or absent. Where are the larger predators? The mammals? The diversity of turtles is incredible. But what about the amphibians? Some ecological niches seem conspicuously empty. Did the lakes act as barriers? Were there population crashes? Or are we just not digging in the right place? Some scientists suggest that the Green River lakes weren't just natural features, they were traps, that the conditions were so perfect for preservation precisely because they were perfect for death. Fish kills may have been frequent, triggered by seasonal overturns or toxic blooms. Birds diving for prey might have drowned and sunk into the anoxic abyss. Insects drawn to the water's edge could have met a similar fate. The lakes were beautiful, yes, but maybe also deadly. And if that's true, then Green River is less a snapshot and more a long exposure of a place that seduced life with abundance and then recorded its demise in extraordinary detail. Yet even in death, there's so much life in these stones. The fossil record here includes some of the earliest known flowering plants in North America, the first true bats, one of the oldest examples of a leafcutter bee, even an ancient relative of the modern primate. These aren't just curiosities. They're data points in the story of how ecosystems evolve, how life adapts, flourishes, and sometimes vanishes without a sound. And despite over a century of excavation, new species are still being found. Amateur collectors pull entire fish from slabs with chisels and luck. Researchers continue to describe new insects, plants, and vertebrates every year. There is no end, just deeper questions. And deeper layers. Because if Wyoming once held subtropical lakes teeming with bats, birds, and crocodiles, then what happened to that world? What erased it? And how many of its survivors, reptilian, avian, or human, kept moving north, or upward, or underground? And just over the ridge, back in the hills east of the Big Horn Basin, there's a place where those survivors, larger, louder, and more armored, came to rest. Where the bones piled high, and the land remembered. Komo Bluff Dinosaur Fossil Site. If you were to stand on the ridgeline at Komo Bluff, Wyoming, and squint just right at the rocky horizon, you might not see anything remarkable at first. Just the typical sprawl of sediment, sun-scorched sagebrush, and distant cattle, the kind of backdrop you'd expect in a western, not a paleontological epic. But dig even a few inches into the soil here, and you're standing on one of the most important fossil treasure troves ever discovered. Welcome to Komo Bluff, where the ground doesn't just whisper of prehistory, it screams it. The site stretches across 8 miles of eroded hills, shale bluffs, and gnarled outcroppings near the town of Medicine Bow. From a distance, it looks like a place where time itself got tired and collapsed. But beneath the crust of ordinary lies one of the richest late Jurassic fossil beds in the world, home to the remains of Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Allosaurus, and many others that became the cornerstones of dinosaur science as we know it today. It was discovered by accident in 1877, during the infamous Bone Wars, a period of cutthroat fossil hunting between paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, whose mutual loathing fueled a race to outdiscover and outname each other into scientific immortality. Komo Bluff was Marsh's ace. A field so rich in dinosaur fossils that it turned the tide in his favor, filling his museum halls and academic papers with names that would become household legends. But this isn't just history, it's also a mystery. Because even now, nearly 150 years after the first bones were pulled from the bluff, the full story of Komo Bluff still refuses to settle into focus. Yes, it yielded some of the earliest and best-known specimens of sauropods, theropods, and ornithischians. But for all its fame, the fossil record here is wildly uneven. Some parts of the site are overrun with certain species' Apatosaurus bones practically stacked on top of each other, while others are curiously lacking in diversity. Entire groups of animals you'd expect to find living alongside them are conspicuously absent. Why? The standard explanation is taphonomic bias, a fancy term for the fossil record plays favorites. Not everything fossilizes equally. Large bones are easier to spot. Delicate creatures, small dinosaurs, mammals, birds, insects tend to rot, crumble, or vanish before they're preserved. But even accounting for this, the imbalance at Komo Bluff is suspicious. Could it be that the site represents only a sliver of a broader ecosystem? Or that certain species actively avoided this area? Or, and this is where things get more intriguing, could the preservation bias be the result of collection bias? The early fossil hunters at Komo Bluff weren't looking for nuance, they were looking for drama. Giant skeletons, complete skulls, impressively long tails. Much of the original excavations were driven by spectacle, not science. So anything that didn't measure up literally may have been ignored, lost, or discarded. This means our understanding of the site's biodiversity is filtered through 19th century ambition. Even today, new digs at Komo Bluff continue to reveal overlooked species, misidentified bones, and incomplete narratives. Modern tools like ground-penetrating radar, CT scans, and isotope analysis are helping to fill in the gaps, but some of those gaps are cavernous. Because for every famous skeleton pulled from the site, there are dozens more still embedded in the hillside, wrapped in stone, refusing to give up their place in the prehistoric cast. There's also the issue of environmental reconstruction. What was Komo Bluff exactly 150 million years ago? A floodplain? A river delta? A drought-stricken basin dotted with watering holes? The Morrison Formation of which Komo Bluff is a part spans several states and millions of years. Trying to pin down a specific ecosystem for a specific site within it is like trying to describe one day of weather during a decade-long storm. But evidence suggests that Komo Bluff was, at least periodically, a gathering point, possibly for water, possibly for migration, possibly for reasons we'll never fully understand. This might explain the dinosaur herds, the seasonal clustering of carcasses, the mass accumulations of sauropod remains. It might also explain the dramatic preservation of some skeletons almost perfectly articulated, while others are scattered, broken, or missing entirely. Was there a predator trap? A river that flooded without warning? A cyclical die-off from drought? None of the available data gives us a solid yes. Instead, Komo Bluff keeps spinning theories back out at us, like bones rising to the surface just to confuse the next dig team. And then there's the human layer. For all its scientific value, Komo Bluff is also a cautionary tale of how discovery can become destruction. Early fossil hunters stripped vast amounts of material without proper documentation. Crates of bones were shipped off with little context. Field notes were sparse, inconsistent, or lost. Some specimens ended up mislabeled in museum drawers for decades, misattributed to the wrong species, the wrong era, even the wrong continent. So what we have, here in this rocky ridge outside Medicine Bow, is both a triumph and a tragedy. A fossil gold mine with no map. A narrative told through fragments, each more iconic and incomplete than the last. And yet, despite its flaws, Komo Bluff still gives. New digs continue, new species emerge, and with each fragment pulled from the earth, we're reminded that the past isn't static, it's evolving, just like the animals it once held. Because if a single ridge in Wyoming can hide that much history in plain sight, how many more stories lie buried deeper still? Up in the cliffs, in caves above ancient rivers, there's a place where people lived and died for thousands of years, layer upon layer. bone upon bone. And in one of those layers, a man was buried and partially mummified by the mountain itself. Mummy Cave. On the jagged cliffs above the North Fork of the Shoshone River, where the crags jut out like broken teeth and the wind sounds like it remembers something you've forgotten, there's a place known as Mummy Cave. It doesn't look like much from the outside, just another dark pocket carved into ancient volcanic stone, hanging 300 feet above the valley floor near what is now the eastern entrance to Yellowstone National Park. But inside this cave, time stacked itself like sediment. Layer by layer, hearth by hearth, life by life. By the time archaeologists started digging in the 1,960 seconds, they realized they weren't just in a cave. They were standing inside a 12,000-year-long record of human occupation, sealed into one of the most pristine stratigraphic sequences in North America. Dozens of distinct cultural layers, generations of habitation, millennia of weather, warfare, winters, rituals, and silence, all compressed into a single high-altitude shelter in northwestern Wyoming. And in one of the final layers, they found the cave's namesake. Mummy Joe, as he's come to be called, was a partially mummified human male, interred in a shallow grave with remnants of fur and fiber still clinging to his remains. Not ancient by comparison to the deepest layers he lived roughly 1,200 years ago, but significant nonetheless. He was buried with intention, face up, hands crossed. Accompanied by tools, points, and cultural artifacts, there was no obvious trauma, no sign of violence, just a man laid to rest in the same cave his ancestors had used for thousands of years. But Joe, as with everything in Mummy Cave, is only part of the mystery. Because what makes this site so haunting isn't the discovery of a single individual, it's the continuity. Most archaeological sites give you a snapshot, a brief flare of activity, a fire pit here, a tool scatter there, maybe a few hundred years of use, then abandonment, erosion, forgetting. Mummy Cave, by contrast, is a timeline with a heartbeat. Evidence shows that people used this cave repeatedly over more than 120 centuries. That's through the end of the Ice Age, the rise and fall of multiple cultural traditions, major shifts in climate, flora, fauna, and technology. And yet, the cave remained in use seasonally, intermittently, strategically. It wasn't a village. It wasn't a permanent residence. It was something more complex, a reliable waypoint in an unpredictable world. So the first mystery becomes, why here? The elevation around 6,300 feet is high enough to challenge, but not deter. The cave faces east, offering morning sun and shelter from prevailing winds. Below it, the river flows with trout and memory. Above it, the Absaroka Mountains rise into grisly territory. It's a place between ecosystems, between biomes, between stories. The cave's contents are equally liminal. Early layers include stone tools typical of Paleoindian hunters, likely pursuing now extinct megafauna. As you move up the sequence, tools shift fulsome, plano, archaic, each cultural toolkit folding into the next. The styles evolve, the materials diversify. You get projectile points, scrapers, bonals, fiber sandals, basket fragments, even tiny needles, still sharp after 1,000 years. But there's something else embedded in those layers. Adaptation. Mummy Cave doesn't just preserve objects, it preserves decisions. You can see when people began incorporating smaller game into their diet: rabbits, marmots, birds. You can track when plant materials became more prominent, when high-altitude foraging grew more sophisticated. As climate cooled and warmed, the site adjusted with it. The cave was reused because it worked, because the rhythms of the landscape never fully abandoned it. Yet for all this continuity, Mummy Cave still resists being pinned down. The sheer depth and precision of its occupational sequence raise more questions than answers. Were these the same people returning year after year, or waves of unrelated groups inheriting a sacred site? Was the cave a winter retreat, a summer stopover, a spiritual sanctuary? We still don't know. Its very consistency is unnerving. Most human patterns are messy. Mummy Cave is almost too clean, too intentional, as if the cave itself had agency. Even the burial of Mummy Joe adds to the ambiguity. Only one burial across 12,000 years? Not zero, not several, just one. Why him? Was he special? A keeper of traditions? A final caretaker as the site was abandoned? Or did his people bury him in the cave not to mark the end of something, but to seal it, to close a story that had been told across centuries? Because after Joe, no one comes back. The uppermost layers are sterile. The fire pits go cold. The tools vanish. The cave falls silent. And just like that, a 12,000-year relationship between humans and this rocky pocket above the river ends. Not with catastrophe, not with violence, just absence. And maybe that's the deepest mystery of all. Not why people came, or what they left behind, but why they stopped. The mountains didn't collapse. The cave didn't fill in. The land didn't betray them. They just walked away. But before they did, they left something on the cliffs and rocks, nearby images scratched into stone, as if trying to explain what words had failed to do. Which brings us to the next question scratched into the red desert stone. Who drew the White Mountain petroglyphs? And what were they trying not to forget? White Mountain petroglyphs. In the middle of Wyoming's red desert, where the landscape ripples with dunes and silence, where wind blows with the persistence of memory and the ground seems to be waiting for something, there is a sandstone cliff that whispers in symbols. This is the site of the White Mountain petroglyphs, a wall etched with the stories of people who are no longer here in a language no one can quite translate. The carvings stretch across pale rock like ghost handwriting. Bison hunts, human figures, handprints, horses, sunbursts, spirals. Some are deeply chiseled, others faint, as if they were meant to fade. There are rows of dots, abstract grids, geometric shapes, and always the sense that someone was trying to be heard, not loudly, but deliberately, as if urgency and reverence could coexist. These petroglyphs are believed to be between 200 and 1,000 years old, with most dating to a period after contact with Europeans, evidenced by images of horses and what appear to be firearms. But some of the carvings may be older, much older. And while scholars have tried to place authorship within specific tribal traditions, Shoshone, Arapaho, or Ute, no single attribution feels complete. The carvings don't just represent a people, they represent a moment, or more accurately, a series of moments. Fragments of time captured on stone by generations of hands. And those hands were steady, purposeful. Take the bison hunt scenes, figures on horseback, spears in mid-thrust, animals with legs bent in motion. These aren't chaotic scribbles. They are kinetic, stylized, repeated. But why? Are they meant as storytelling, teaching tools, ritual reenactments? Are they depictions of actual hunts, or symbolic ones? No one knows. Some archaeologists believe the images may represent vision quests, spiritual journeys carved into the rock as a form of personal or ceremonial documentation. Others interpret them as prophetic markings, meant to record dreams or divine messages. But the symbols resist neat categorization. For every recognizable scene, horses, humans, animals, there are just as many abstractions, spiral forms, radiating lines, concentric circles. These appear across petroglyph sites throughout the West, but here they seem to float between the literal and the metaphysical. Are they maps, calendars, cosmological diagrams? Or expressions of something we no longer have the cultural context to decipher? Then there are the handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the rock as if reaching across time. Some are small, possibly made by children. Others are large and smeared, not stenciled like in other regions, but almost pushed into the surface, as though the makers were trying to leave more than an image trying to leave themselves. It's difficult to overstate how isolated the White Mountain petroglyphs feel. Even today, getting there requires commitment. A long drive through Bureau of Land Management backroads, past desert plains that don't advertise their history. The cliffs rise suddenly from the flatness, weathered and almost sullen, until you realize they're covered in symbols that never meant to be found easily. And maybe that's the point. Because unlike the ceremonial grandeur of the medicine wheel or the social clustering of Legend Rock, White Mountain feels personal. These images don't read like collective declarations. They read like individual testimonies. Not group statements, but private thoughts made public through the permanence of stone. And yet, these personal marks are now orphaned. The people who made them are gone. The oral traditions that may have once explained them have either faded or been kept close by modern descendants who don't owe us answers. Archaeologists can hypothesize. Tribal historians can suggest meanings. But no one can say with certainty what the symbols were meant to do. Which leads to a different question. Who was supposed to see them? Were the carvings meant for other people? For spirits? For ancestors? Or were they left behind for those who had not yet come for the future, or maybe for the land itself? There's also the practical mystery. Why here? The Red Desert is harsh, unpredictable, and often overlooked. It's not a place of abundance, it's a place of survival. So why carve into the cliffs of a semi-barren plain? Why not nearer to rivers, valleys, or trade routes? Perhaps because this was a crossroads not of commerce, but of spirit. A liminal zone between mountain and basin, between cultures, between ways of living that were changing fast. The arrival of horses, the spread of European weapons, the pressure of westward expansion, these things were already reshaping the West during the time some of these carvings were made. And maybe the petroglyphs weren't just marking presence. Maybe they were marking loss. A way of saying, we were here, this was ours, and it still is, even if we have to say it with symbols no one can read anymore. In that way, the White Mountain petroglyphs don't just speak for themselves. They speak for every culture that left something behind and didn't expect to be understood, only remembered. And as the desert winds continue to wear down the rock, they leave behind the same question the artists may have asked with every cut into stone. If we carve it deep enough, will the land remember? Further upslope, as the snow melts in the Alpine shadows and climate shifts uncover long-lost artifacts, something older is beginning to surface. Not carvings, but the tools of survival. Alpine and permafrost revealed sites. High above the tree line, where the landscape turns to stone and sky, Wyoming's alpine zones are shedding their secrets. Not because scientists are digging, but because the ice after thousands of years is finally letting go. In recent decades, rising global temperatures have begun to melt ice patches and small glaciers in the Wind River Range and surrounding high-altitude regions. What's emerging isn't just meltwater, it's history. Spears, arrows, bone fragments, shreds of hide and cloth. Items so old and fragile they should have decayed long ago. But instead, they lay preserved in frozen silence, waiting for a world warm enough to wake them up again. This is not a planned excavation. It's an accidental unburying. And it's rewriting what we thought we knew about human activity in Wyoming's alpine zones. For years, archaeologists assumed that high-altitude areas were only used seasonally, if at all. These were rugged, cold, oxygen-thin environments, inhospitable for long-term human habitation. Maybe hunters ventured into the mountains in late summer. Maybe gatherers climbed for berries or pine nuts. But it was always assumed to be short-term, peripheral, exceptional. Then the ice started melting, and the past began to complicate itself. In 2007, a team of archaeologists working in Wyoming's Wind River Range discovered a 4,000-year-old dart fragment emerging from a melting ice patch. It was made of wood and sinew, still intact. That shouldn't have been possible. Organic materials like this usually decompose within decades, let alone millennia. But here, it was frozen, sheltered, preserved. Since then, dozens of artifacts have surfaced in similar conditions. Some are broken tools. Some are full projectile points, still hafted to wooden shafts. There are bits of clothing, hide scraps, animal bones, all appearing in places where people weren't supposed to live, let alone thrive. These discoveries echo similar finds in places like the Canadian Yukon and the Rocky Mountains of Montana and Colorado. But Wyoming's alpine melt zones have their own story, their own mystery, because so much of what's emerging doesn't match up with existing site maps or settlement models. For starters, why were people here at all? These weren't casual hikes. These were tool-carrying, task-oriented expeditions into dangerous terrain. The presence of hunting weapons suggests they weren't just passing through. They were following game. Some likely tracked mountain sheep, marmots, and other highland animals. Others might have been collecting resources, pine nuts, medicinal plants, specific types of stone. But here's the twist. These activities weren't anomalies. They appear to have been systematic, repeated across generations. This wasn't someone getting lost. This was part of a broader strategy. A cultural rhythm that included the Alpine zone as a regular part of life, not just a desperate detour. And yet, no permanent structures have been found. No villages, no long-term camps, just tools and fragments, small, lonely objects, speaking of large, forgotten movements. A dart shaft in one melt patch, a hide-wrapped bundle in another. They appear, then vanish back into silence. As if the mountains themselves are curating the narrative. You may see this piece, but not the whole. What makes this more unsettling is how fragile the evidence island. The same warmth that reveals these artifacts also destroys them. Once exposed, ancient organic materials degrade rapidly, sometimes within days. What the ice preserved for 3,000 years can be ruined in 3 sunny afternoons. It's a race against a slow disaster, and it's not one we're winning. Many of the high-altitude artifacts are undatable by traditional means. Radiocarbon samples are often contaminated or too degraded. Context is missing. There are no intact layers, no stratigraphy, no hearths or middens, just ice. Then no ice. Then an object, alone. Which raises another uncomfortable question. How much have we already lost? How many centuries of alpine human activity melted away before anyone thought to look up? And beyond that, what do these artifacts mean? Are they isolated accidents or the edges of a much larger network of alpine use? Did these highland trips tie into broader trade routes, seasonal ceremonies, or spiritual traditions? Were they rites of passage, escapes, exiles? The items don't say, but their presence challenges the notion of prehistoric people as passive actors shaped by climate. These were adaptive, mobile, resilient individuals who knew the landscape better than we ever will. They didn't avoid the hard places. They went to them deliberately. And what's most chilling, ironically, is how many of these ancient pieces resemble modern tools. A finely carved wooden dart shaft, a carefully stitched hide wrapping, a tool hafted with sinew and resin. There's something human in all of it, painstaking, practical, and personal. Not distant, not alien, familiar. They are, in many ways, love letters from the past, written in wood and ice instead of ink, and they're arriving just as the paper they're written on begins to dissolve. Because the melting isn't stopping. The climate is shifting faster than archaeology can keep up. Every summer reveals more, and every winter preserves less. So, as the mountains continue to bleed history into the sun, we're left wondering, how many generations walked these ridgelines, hunted these peaks, watched the same clouds roll in, and if their lives are thawing now, what will remain when the snow is finally gone? Below those same ridgelines, hidden in the valleys of the Bighorns, strange wooden structures rise empty, weathered, and mostly unclaimed. Not quite homes. Not quite ruins. But something in between. Timber divided by war lodges in the Bighorn and Ten Sleep region. Deep in the folds of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, nestled among weathered ridges and wind-blown timberline, are conical wooden structures that look like someone built them halfway between a dream and a warning. Some are no more than a few collapsed logs in a circle. Others stand upright, slouched but defiant, weathered by centuries of snow, rain, and the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. These are the so-called timber lodges, or sometimes war lodges, and their existence is as undeniable as their purpose is unknown. They appear in remote high-altitude meadows, often above 9,000 feet. No roads, no trails, just silence and the sound of wind moving through lodgepole pine. The structures are almost always circular or conical, often formed from long, peeled logs, leaned together in a teepee shape or arranged into crude enclosures. Some are ringed with stones. Others are built into the landscape itself, pressed against rock walls or sheltered by trees, and yet none of them feel quite lived in. They're not settlements. They're not outposts. They're not cabins or lookouts or forts. They're just there, which, of course, makes them infinitely more interesting. The structures are often called war lodges in regional folklore, mostly because no one knows what else to call them. Some locals say they were used by warriors before battle. Others think they were ceremonial shelters, sweat lodges, hunting blinds, or temporary altars. The truth is, no one knows for sure despite decades of speculation, study, and wild-eyed theory. What we do know is this: the majority of these timber lodges show no signs of permanent habitation. No hearths, no food remains, no storage pits, very few tools. Occasionally, you'll find a worked stone nearby or a scatter of debitage flakes from tool-making, but nothing that shouts domestic use. Which rules out the most obvious explanation, that they were simply homes. Even the age of the structures is elusive. Wood as a material doesn't lend itself well to long-term survival in the open, and dating techniques like dendrochronology, tree ring analysis are difficult when the logs have been exposed, moved, or scavenged by time. A handful of the structures have been tested and dated to within the last few hundred years, but that doesn't mean others aren't older, much older. Some archaeologists believe that a few of these timber lodges could date back over 1,000 years, surviving only because of the cold, dry Alpine climate and their remote locations. That's not just old, it's anomalous. Wooden architecture of this age is almost unheard of in North American archaeology, simply because wood doesn't usually get a chance to last that long. And yet, here they are. The locations are part of the mystery. The lodges tend to appear near high passes, ridge crests, or secluded alpine basins, not the easiest places to build anything, let alone carry logs. Constructing one of these shelters would have required effort, planning, and intent, not something you throw together in an afternoon. And the fact that they're built at elevations where weather can change in minutes raises another question. Why here? Were they signal points? Part of a visual network across peaks and valleys? Were they spiritual thresholds, meant to mark territory or passage into sacred space? Some researchers have noted their alignment with astronomical markers, suggesting they might have tracked the movement of the sun, stars, or seasonal shifts. Others believe they were used during vision quests, solitary rituals that required isolation, endurance, and exposure. Then there's the oral history. Among some indigenous groups, particularly Crow and Shoshone, the high mountains are associated with powerful spiritual forces. They are not just places to hunt or travel, but places to encounter something else, the divine, the ancestral, the unseen. Within this context, the timber lodges may not have been shelters at all, but offerings, built not for comfort, but for the opposite, for confrontation with something larger than oneself. But much of this is speculation. What's frustrating and poetic is that the structures offer no clear answers, no definitive artifacts, no writing, no tools of war, no bones. Just logs, leaned and weathered, still standing in defiance of erosion and curiosity. And perhaps that's the point. These timber lodges don't explain themselves because they weren't meant to. They were built for reasons that may no longer exist, purposes that died with their makers, or purposes that still exist but not for us. Because the more we look at them through the lens of practicality, the less sense they make. They weren't efficient, they weren't comfortable, they weren't logical, but they were important. You don't drag pine logs uphill for no reason. You don't build at 10,000 feet unless you need to be seen or need not to be found. Maybe they were warnings. Maybe they were promises. Maybe they were thresholds. And if these strange alpine skeletons were built as places of ritual, exile, or encounter, then who exactly were the builders trying to meet? Because in the same mountains, in the same valleys, there are stories that whisper of small people, fierce and hidden, who once watched the highlands from the shadows. And one of them may still be waiting. Legend of the Little People, Nimerigar folklore. There's a certain kind of story that persists, not because it's proven, not because it's convenient, but because it refuses to go away. In Wyoming, one such story drifts through the mountain air like smoke from a fire no one remembers starting. The legend of the Little People, sometimes called the Nimerigar. Ask around the Wind River Range, the Big Horn Basin, or the valleys of the Shoshone and Crow, and someone will eventually mention them, if only quietly. They're said to be tiny, fierce beings. Not fairies, not gnomes, nothing whimsical. The Nimerigar are small in stature, but not in presence. Warriors, tricksters, sorcerers, sometimes helpful, but more often feared. And while European folklore has its elves and brownies, this isn't that. This is indigenous, rooted in the oral traditions of Plains and Mountain West tribes, particularly among the Shoshone, Arapaho, and Crow. The stories are old, consistent, and deeply uneasy. Descriptions of the Nimerigar vary slightly, but the core elements hold. They stood only a couple of feet tall, lived in the mountains, wore tiny clothes, shot poisoned arrows, hid their villages in inaccessible places. Some stories say they would attack full-grown humans who stumbled into their territory. Others claim they could speak, heal, or even predict the future, but only under specific, mysterious conditions. They were not whimsical creatures. They were boundary keepers, guardians, warnings. And the strangest part? The stories almost always insist they were real. Not metaphorical, not spiritual archetypes, actual people. Small in size, capable of speech, thought, combat. The Nimerigar weren't spirits of the land, they were inhabitants. It would be easy to dismiss all this as folklore, and for decades, that's exactly what people did until 1932, when a mummified body was discovered in the San Pedro Mountains of Wyoming. Seated, cross-legged, with massive eye sockets, a squashed nose, and a grin that seemed far too knowing for something dead, the mummy measured only about 14 inches tall, in its position estimated to be around 36 inches if fully extended. Locals called him Pedro. He was photographed, x-rayed, and shown to the world. His skeleton was fully formed. His teeth were worn. His skull was thick. Some experts said he was a full-grown adult. Others insisted he was an infant with a severe deformity, possibly anencephaly. But even then, things didn't line up. The preservation was too perfect, the burial too deliberate. The location, a sealed chamber in a mountain cave, too intentional. Then, as we covered earlier, Pedro vanished, passed from collector to collector, until he faded into mystery right alongside the legends he was supposed to disprove. And still, the stories persisted. Among the Crow, there are tales of little people who lived in the prior mountains, feared and respected. The Arapaho speak of small beings who lived in stone houses and would punish those who trespassed. The Shoshone say the Nimerigar were a real tribe. Tiny, yes, but clever and fierce. They fought each other constantly, waged war with neighboring peoples, and had their own rules. And when they died, they were buried in secret mountain tombs. Buried, as in, still out there. Which brings us back to Wyoming's high country. To the ridgelines above high-rise village, the timber lodges with no clear purpose, the Alpine basins that show signs of occupation with no lasting footprints. Could these places have been part of the Nimirigar world? Used by them, built by them, hidden by them? It's a stretch, but not impossible. And here's where science throws up its hands. There's no hard proof of a race of miniature humans in North America. None. But there's also no consensus on what Pedro was, or how he fits into the puzzle. And more importantly, there's a reluctance, an institutional hesitance to even look into it too deeply. Because to chase stories of the Nimirigar is to risk being labeled a crank, a fringe theorist. But ignoring them means ignoring the repeated, consistent testimonies of multiple tribes across hundreds of years groups that had no reason to invent the same creature across vast distances and cultural divides. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between anthropology and myth, between X-ray films and oral tradition, between the seen and the never again seen. The Nimirigar live in that space, just enough evidence to tempt, never enough to satisfy. And maybe that's why they endure. Because the human mind is hardwired to chase symmetry, to connect dots, to fill in the blanks. And the Nimirigar? They are all blank, no known settlements, no named individuals. Just whispered warnings, carved memories, and a single vanished mummy. But what if they weren't alone? Because across Wyoming, there's more than just legend connecting distant places. There's evidence of trade, long, winding networks that moved goods, stories, and people across impossible terrain. And maybe they moved more than that. Trade and migration networks, pre-European contact. Before there were wagons, before horses, before maps and borders and the illusion of permanence, there were paths. Worn into the earth not by roads, but by repetition, footfalls, hoofprints, quiet migrations that left no highway signs, only faint trails and long memories. And across what is now Wyoming, those paths carried more than just people. They carried stone, stories, shells, sinew, obsidian, and meaning. If you strip away the assumptions of isolation that pre-contact cultures were static, bound by terrain, or unaware of each other, you begin to see something far more intricate. A network, not of cities or states, but of seasonal movement, resource exchange, and cultural connection stretching from the Pacific to the plains. Wyoming, sitting awkwardly in the center of the continent, was less a boundary than a convergence zone. And somehow, despite its mountains and deserts, or maybe because of them, people kept moving through it. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of surprisingly complex trade long before any European boots hit the soil. We're not talking about gold or silk caravans. We're talking about the long haul of survival. Flint for knives, obsidian for arrowheads, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico or the California coast turning up hundreds of miles inland, dried fish, redwood beads, pipes carved from stone not found within 500 miles, buffalo robes, cordage, medicines, myths. It wasn't just material that moved. It was culture, style, language, spiritual ideas. Wyoming's place in this network wasn't as a center of production. It was a crossroads. A junction where high mountain trails met low river corridors, where plains, tribes, desert dwellers, and mountain people all passed through, even if they didn't stay. Take Knife River flint. For instance, a fine-grained stone, prized for its workability, sourced mainly from North Dakota. Artifacts made from it have been found across the Big Horn Basin, at elevations where the stone doesn't naturally occur. This means either the flint moved through direct trade or through intermediary exchange, changing hands over hundreds of miles, carried in pouches, traded at campsites, left behind in kill sites and fire pits. Then there's obsidian volcanic glass used for tools and ceremonial objects. Wyoming's own obsidian sources, like those near Yellowstone, were used by local peoples, but obsidian from Idaho, Utah, and even Oregon has also been found in the region. Using geochemical fingerprinting, scientists can trace a single arrowhead's origin across the West, like a postal stamp for deep time. And what it reveals is astonishing: movement. Not in straight lines, but in waves, loops, circles, a web. And here's where things get tricky. We don't fully understand how this trade functioned. Were there dedicated traders? Seasonal meetups? Did knowledge pass alongside material goods? Was there a proto-currency? Or were objects exchanged through kinship, obligation, or ritual? We know people moved. But we don't know who controlled the movement, or why some items traveled further than others. What we do know is that certain sites in Wyoming appear again and again, not as large villages, but as nodes, staging areas, lookouts, high-altitude camps with imported tools, kill sites with projectile points from distant regions. Places like High-Rise Village, Sunrise, and the Lost Creek area all bear evidence of transient, interconnected use. People came, people left. But what they brought with them and left behind tells us they weren't just surviving, they were connected. There's also the evidence of linguistic migration. Though harder to pin archaeologically, many linguists suggest that Athabascan-speaking peoples, the ancestors of the Navajo and Apache, migrated from the subarctic into the American Southwest. That route may have passed through the Plains and Rockies, right through what is now Wyoming. The land holds the silence of those footsteps, even if the language has faded. Oral traditions among Plains tribes speak of distant relations, of ancient migrations, of encounters and exchanges with people who came from the mountains or disappeared into the sky. These are not maps, but they are memory that often predates our confidence in the archaeological timeline. So, where does that leave us? With a mystery that isn't about what was found, but what passed through. Because Wyoming is full of sites that hint at presence, but also at absence, at people who came for a reason and left for another, leaving behind just enough to raise questions, but not enough to answer them. We don't know how many languages were spoken here 1,000 years ago. We don't know how many alliances, marriages, or betrayals shaped the trails we now walk as tourists. We don't know whether a child on the Wind River once wore a pendant made from a Pacific shell and understood exactly where it came from, or never even asked. All we know is that the land was never still. And if it once carried people, ideas, and artifacts across hundreds of miles without roads or wheels, what else did it carry? What sacred knowledge, what patterns of stars, what ways of seeing the world were passed down the line and then dropped? Just over the horizon, atop a wind-scoured mountain where the stars still burn through the thin air, sits a ring of stone so old and enigmatic that even the modern astronomers can't quite explain it. And some say it wasn't just a calendar. It was a compass, Medicine Wheel divided by Medicine Mountain. At nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, balanced on the wind-swept summit of Medicine Mountain in Wyoming's Bighorn Range, sits a ring of stones that has no business being where it island. It's not a ruin. It's not a building. It's a pattern both simple and impossible. They call it the Medicine Wheel, and even the name is an echo, borrowed from what it might have been, not what it definitively island. Because despite decades of research, spiritual reflection, and scientific modeling, no one really knows who built it, exactly when it was constructed, or what it was originally meant to do. And yet, it remains. 65 feet in diameter, with 28 spokes radiating from a central cairn like a sunburst in stone, the Medicine Wheel anchors itself to both the sky and the earth. Around the circle sit 6 smaller cairns, arranged with an elegance that feels mathematical. These cairns aren't random. They point subtly, but consistently, to key astronomical events. The summer solstice sunrise, the setting of particular stars like Aldebaran, Sirius, and Rigel, and even the heliacal rising of the Pleiades. It's not just a rock circle. It's an observatory, a ceremonial compass, a calendar carved into a mountain. But it's also a riddle. Carbon dating is difficult with stone, but associated artifacts and lichen growth studies suggest the medicine wheel was likely built between 300 and 1,000 years ago, though some believe it could be much older. Perhaps even 3,000 to 5,000 years. That range is wide enough to make any conclusion feel like a shrug. The Crow people, who have a deep spiritual connection to the site, say the wheel was here before them. Other tribes, including the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, and Arapaho, all hold stories of the place. Some say it was used to speak with ancestors. Some say it was a place of vision. Some say it was where the stars came to listen. What's striking isn't just that it exists, but where it exists. The medicine wheel was built at high elevation, exposed to violent storms, unpredictable weather, and snowfields that last into June. It's not near a water source. It's not near known habitation areas. It's not practical. Which means it was built on purpose. With purpose. Someone went out of their way to be here. Someone carried stones, laid out a design, aligned it with the heavens, and did so in a place no one would build anything unless they meant it. But for what? That question splits the researchers from the spiritualists. Astronomers see the alignments and see data, an ancient tool for tracking time, mapping the cosmos, understanding seasonal shifts. Anthropologists see ritual, pilgrimage, gathering. Others see both, but no one can agree on which came first. Was the structure built as a response to the stars? Or was it built first, then repurposed as astronomy caught up? There are no written records, only stories. One such story tells of a great bird, often interpreted as a thunderbird that flew between worlds and left the wheel as a symbol of the balance between earth and sky. Another says the spokes represent the ribs of a massive buffalo, the wheel being its body laid out as an offering to the Creator. Others suggest the circle represents the four directions, the seasons, the stages of life, birth, youth, adulthood, death, a cosmogram rendered in rock. There's something uncomfortable about the way the site defies appropriation. New Age seekers have tried to retrofit it into various belief systems. Government agencies have tried to label it, fence it, and interpret it. None of it fits. The wheel resists being claimed. Like the mountain itself, it seems to operate on a timeline and logic that isn't ours. And maybe that's the point. The medicine here isn't in the rocks. It's in the questions they raise. How did people who had no telescopes align these stones with distant stars? What knowledge was passed down orally, generation to generation, that allowed for such precise celestial tracking? What ceremonies were performed here, and what did the participants see when they closed their eyes? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what knowledge did they have that we've forgotten? Because we treat the past like a ladder always ascending. But the medicine wheel suggests another shape, a circle, one that turns and returns, one that watches the stars until the stars shift and it no longer aligns, one that remains after its purpose has been obscured by snow, by time, by disinterest. Today, the wheel is protected. Visitors are welcome but must keep a respectful distance. Prayers are still left on the fence line. Feathers tied to the ropes dance in the wind. It is not an artifact. It is still alive. But it's also alone, because the cultures that once placed the stones are no longer here in the same way. Their descendants remember, but even they admit, sometimes, that parts of the story are gone. And elsewhere in Wyoming, along forgotten trails and overgrown hills, those stories may still linger not in monuments, but in hearths, buried beneath the soil, countless campfires, cooking sites, living spaces that lasted for thousands of years and then disappeared without a sound. But their warmth is still detectable, if you know where to dig. Many hearths and buried features in the Arapaho and Lost Creek site. Across the high plains of southern Wyoming, Amid the low hills and intermittent streams of the Arapaho and Lost Creek areas lies a strange kind of archaeological site, one that doesn't announce itself with towering ruins. Stone rings, or mummified remains. There's no monument here, no singular object to photograph. Instead, the story is written in shadows beneath the soil, where thousands of years of human activity left behind little more than patches of fire-darkened earth, subtle depressions, and occasional artifacts scattered like punctuation in a sentence that's been buried too long to read aloud. What archaeologists have found here is both deceptively simple and deeply unsettling in its implications. A 9-kilometer stretch of near-continuous human occupation spanning more than 9,000 years. Layer after layer of hearths. Repeated episodes of return. The same sites used over and over again by groups, separated not just by generations, but by entire cultural eras. These aren't grand encampments. They're not cities. They are ephemeral small hearths, shallow pits, subtle soil stains left by wooden posts, and the occasional cluster of stone tools. But there are hundreds of them, maybe thousands, depending on how you draw the boundaries. They dot the landscape like faint constellations, only visible if you know where to look. And the mystery is not just that they're there, it's why they're there, and why they kept being used. Because the Lost Creek and Arapaho areas don't offer anything obviously special. No nearby mineral deposits, no unique water sources. The terrain is flat, the weather is inconsistent. The view, while wide, doesn't explain the dedication. But somehow, for millennia, this unremarkable stretch of grassland became a preferred stop in the seasonal circuits of ancient peoples. Some hearths contain the charred remains of bison bone, suggesting organized communal hunts. Others contain only plant residues, hinting at foraging or food processing. Many are shallow, used just once or twice. But a few are deep, rebuilt multiple times, layer upon layer, suggesting families or groups returning to the exact same spot, generation after generation, as if the land had memory, as if the fire pit mattered more than the landscape around it. What's even more haunting is what's not there. Despite thousands of years of use, there are very few permanent structures. No large shelters, no storage pits, no longhouses. The people who came here, and kept coming back, left the lightest of footprints. Their architecture, if you can call it that, was made of perishable materials. Wood, hide, bone things that vanish over time. All that remains is what survived the flame. Charcoal, ash, cracked stone, and the occasional bone too stubborn to decay. In other words, this isn't a story of permanence. It's a story of mobility. Of people who moved with the seasons, with the herds, with the wind, but who marked their world with tiny, recurring anchors in the landscape. Hearths as memory, fire as home. And yet, for all the minimalism, the pattern suggests something deeply intentional. These weren't random stops. The hearths are clustered along travel corridors, water routes, and ecological transition zones. The locations allowed access to both highland and lowland resources. Some may have been way stations, others rendezvous points, meeting places, exchange sites, locations where families reconnected, shared food, told stories, and remembered how not to forget. But without structures, without writing, without even stone circles to draw attention to themselves, these sites went unnoticed for a long time. It was only through aerial surveys, subsurface testing, and sheer archaeological persistence that their scale began to emerge. And now that we can see it, we're left with the uncomfortable realization that this was likely the norm, not the exception. That most human history, especially in North America, looks like this: quiet, low impact, mobile, and deeply connected to place, in a way that doesn't rely on permanence to be meaningful. And here's where the mystery deepens further. Across this 9-kilometer stretch, the cultural markers shift over time point types, tool styles, dietary remains, all suggesting different groups, different eras, but the sites don't change. The spots remain in use, as if knowledge was passed down. This is where you stop. This is where you build your fire. This is where you listen. And what were they listening for? The ground offers no definitive answers, but the landscape whispers possibilities. Wind patterns that reveal water, animal trails, seasonal flowerings, stars that rise just over a particular ridgeline. In a world where knowledge was oral, symbolic, and ecological, these cues weren't decorations, they were navigation systems. What we're looking at is not a campsite, it's a map, a ritualized geography, a memory palace written not in walls, but in warmth. And the unsettling truth? We almost missed it, because archaeology tends to favor the dramatic, the monumental. But here, the drama lies in the repetition, in the persistence, in the refusal to build big when small would do. And if this is what survived, these subtle stains and ash layers, what else existed that left no mark at all? Just beyond these fire pits, beyond the rolling plains, and into the uplifted edges of Wyoming's deep geological past, there's a landscape not shaped by fire or hands, but by time itself. And underneath that ancient sediment, entire fossil worlds remain hidden, waiting not to be remembered, but simply discovered. Big Horn Basin, fossil, deposit, mapping, and prediction. At a glance, the Big Horn Basin doesn't look like the kind of place that hides anything. It stretches across northern Wyoming like a broad, exhausted sigh, open, exposed, a landscape made of scars. The wind howls freely here, tearing across the rolling badlands, throwing dust into the air like it's trying to erase the past before anyone can dig it up. But under that baked crust of shale and clay lies a story so vast, so old, and so fragmented that even the most advanced scientific models can barely scratch its surface. The Big Horn Basin is a fossil hunter's dream and a paleontologist's nightmare. It is both overflowing with ancient life and stubbornly unpredictable. Some layers yield fossils by the dozen early mammals, reptiles, plants, even rare birds, while others, just a few feet away, remain maddeningly empty. For more than a century, scientists have pulled astonishing finds from these rocks. But for all the bones they've cataloged, for all the teeth, shells, and plant impressions carefully bagged and boxed, the basin still refuses to make sense. This isn't a matter of bad science. It's a problem of deep time and how incredibly hard it is to find a needle in a haystack when the haystack is made of 60 million years worth of dirt. Enter the modern solution, predictive fossil mapping, a blend of satellite imaging, GIS modeling, remote sensing, geological surveys, and a little bit of hope. The idea is straightforward: use data to figure out where fossils are most likely to be. Feed in everything we know about sediment types, erosion rates, fossil density, paleo environments, and climate reconstructions. Let the algorithms do what humans can't, see patterns across hundreds of square miles. The results? Promising and problematic. These models have helped researchers identify new fossil-rich sites, especially in hard-to-reach terrain. But they've also failed spectacularly in places that should produce fossils and don't. A layer predicted to contain Eocene mammal remains might turn up nothing but shale flakes. A nearby hill, considered unremarkable, could be hiding an entirely new genus of ancient primate. It's not a question of whether the models are wrong, they're often right. It's that the Big Horn Basin doesn't care about our models. One reason is the basin's extreme geological complexity. Unlike neatly stratified fossil beds, the Big Horn Basin is a place of twisting sediment, faulting, uplift, and erosion on an epic scale. Layers from vastly different periods sit side by side. Ancient floodplains are overlain by volcanic ash. What should be horizontal is tilted. What should be deep is at the surface. It's a geological jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were rearranged by earthquakes before we even knew what the picture was supposed to be. Another problem? Sampling bias. For decades, fossil hunters, both academic and amateur, have been going to the same areas. Not because they're the best, but because they're the easiest to reach. Roads, rivers, and familiar formations get most of the attention. That skews the data. Models built on biased input tend to produce biased output. And in the Big Horn Basin, that means entire swaths of fossil-rich terrain may still be completely unexamined. What might be out there? That's the part that keeps scientists up at night. The basin's fossil record spans from the late Cretaceous into the early Paleogene, from the age of dinosaurs into the rise of mammals. It's one of the few places on Earth where you can trace the fallout of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event in almost continuous layers. There are rocks here that capture the moment the world changed, when massive reptiles vanished and fuzzy little survivors inherited the Earth. But that inheritance isn't well understood. Mammals diversified rapidly, in unexpected ways. Climate oscillated wildly. Ecosystems restructured themselves in real time. The fossil record in the Big Horn Basin doesn't show a simple, linear progression. It shows bursts of evolution, strange dead ends, and gaps, huge, yawning gaps where entire species should be and aren't. Some of these gaps are real. Some are tricks of preservation. Some are just waiting. That's why researchers are now pushing for machine learning models to supplement traditional GIS using not just rock formations, but mineralogy, satellite data, historical dig patterns, vegetation cover, even climate anomalies to predict fossil hotspots. The models are getting better, but the landscape keeps shifting. Erosion reveals one site and erases another. The Earth doesn't wait for funding cycles. And there's the philosophical twist. Even if we could find every fossil in the basin, we'd still be left with interpretation. Fossils don't explain themselves. They don't say why a species migrated or why it disappeared. They don't tell us what behaviors vanished without leaving bones behind. The fossil record is a whisper, not a speech. Still, the Big Horn Basin keeps calling. It's a fossil landscape shaped by chaos, governed by probability, and haunted by the knowledge that we've probably missed more than we've ever found. Because every bone pulled from the earth is a story interrupted, and for every story uncovered, 10 more remain buried under stone and silence. And as scientists map the paths of extinction, adaptation, and emergence through deep time, one pressing question rises. How did ancient life survive the warming events that once scorched this land? Because they did. And what they left behind might hold answers to the warming future we now face. Fossils and climate warming study. Cenozoic mammals to 58 million years old. Somewhere around 58 million years ago, in the steaming aftermath of one of Earth's greatest extinction events, the land we now call Wyoming was unrecognizable. Gone were the dinosaurs, vanished in the sudden, fiery punctuation mark at the end of the Cretaceous. What rose in their absence was something smaller, furrier, and far more adaptable. This was the age of mammals, not in their final form, but in their beginning. Clumsy, opportunistic survivors crawling out from the shadows of extinction into a world that was warming, fast. And that's where the mystery begins, not just in the creatures themselves, but in how they responded to a planet that was heating at a rate eerily familiar to our own time. Today, the fossil beds of Wyoming's Big Horn Basin, Willwood Formation, and surrounding Paleogene-era strata offer one of the richest windows into this ancient story. They preserve not just bones, but transitions, moments in time when the climate changed and the living world scrambled to catch up. The period that draws the most attention from paleoclimatologists and evolutionary biologists is known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM. It was a spike, a relatively brief but intense period of global warming, marked by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere, sea temperature rises, and widespread ecosystem disruption. Sound familiar? What makes the PETM especially valuable isn't just the fact that it happened, but that it's preserved in exquisite detail beneath Wyoming soil. In the Big Horn Basin, Researchers have identified sediment layers that show rapid shifts in temperature, rainfall, and vegetation, corresponding precisely to the onset of the PETM. Above those layers, we see something incredible: mammals changing size, shape, and behavior in real time. For example, early horse ancestors, like Cypripus, which were already the size of a small dog, actually shrank during this warming event by as much as 30%. This phenomenon, known as dwarfism, seems to have been a direct response to increased heat and possibly decreased food availability. After the climate stabilized, these species grew larger again. But it's not just horses. Primates, rodents, even early carnivores all showed changes in body size, dental morphology, and geographic range. And it all happened over a few thousand years, a blink of an eye, in evolutionary terms. The fossil record here isn't just documenting what animals existed, it's showing how fast they could adapt, or fail to. Because alongside the survivors are the vanishing axe species that disappear from the record with no explanation. Did they migrate? Did they go extinct? Did they evolve into something else so quickly we no longer recognize them? The sediment doesn't tell us, but it hints. And here's the deeper mystery. What triggered the PETM? Some theories suggest massive volcanic activity. Others point to methane release from ocean clathrates, frozen deposits that melt and release gas when temperatures rise. There's evidence for both. But the real question isn't just what caused it, it's why it matters now. Because the PETM is one of the closest analogs we have for modern climate change. Carbon was released, temperatures spiked, life reacted. Some thrived, some didn't. The similarities are uncomfortable. Back then, carbon levels rose over several thousand years. Today, they've spiked in less than 200. And here's where the fossils get disturbing, not because they show catastrophe, but because they show resilience with limits. Mammals adapted up to a point. Plants shifted their ranges. Insects followed. Food webs restructured themselves, but only within certain thresholds. Beyond that, things broke. Species vanished. Ecosystems collapsed. The fossil record doesn't lie, but it also doesn't give us clean narratives. The Cenozoic layers of Wyoming show a world in flux, but not chaos. They show incremental changes, lag effects, and delayed collapses. Just because the world doesn't fall apart overnight doesn't mean it isn't falling apart. And that's what keeps researchers coming back, not just to count bones, but to read the tempo of change, to understand how ecosystems unravel, reweave, and sometimes disappear altogether. The Cenozoic mammals of Wyoming aren't just relics, they're case studies. Every tooth, every femur, every microscopic layer of carbon in the soil is part of a deep time warning system. A record of what happens when the thermostat is left running too long. And yet, in the midst of the warming, life went on. New species emerged, new strategies evolved, complexity returned, but it was never the same. And perhaps that's the quiet truth these fossils hold. The world doesn't end, it just becomes something else. We, like the mammals of the Paleocene, are living in a hinge moment. Only this time, we have the benefit of hindsight. And in Wyoming's ancient soils, the message isn't subtle. It's buried, yes, but not hidden. Just beneath the warming earth, the bones, remember. And scattered across the state, in long-forgotten gullies and once-lush floodplains, entire herds of dinosaurs once died together, piled into unnatural graves, preserved in chaos. And no one can quite agree on why. Exact cause of mass death and fossil accumulation in certain bone beds. If you dig into the earth in parts of Wyoming, particularly around places like the Hansen Ranch bone bed, Komo Bluff, and stretches of the Lance and Morrison formations, you'll eventually strike something strange. Not just fossils, but fossils stacked in unsettling numbers. Herd animals clustered unnaturally, predators mixed with prey, skulls crushed against rib cages. Death piled upon death, in what looks less like the slow drift of extinction and more like a single, violent exhale from the planet itself. Paleontologists call them mass death assemblages, and they are exactly what they sound like, whole groups of animals that seem to have died together, under conditions we still don't fully understand. In some cases, the bones lie in perfect articulation, skeletons preserved in repose. In others, it's a jumble, disarticulated, fragmented, as if tossed into the dirt by a blindfolded giant, with no regard for narrative clarity. You might find 10 Edmontosaurus skeletons within a few meters, crushed together, bones overlapping, impossible to separate without feeling like you're dismantling a crime scene, and in a way, you are. Because the truth is, no one knows exactly what killed them. There are theories, of course, lots of them. Flash floods, volcanic ash falls, drought-driven migrations gone wrong, toxic algae blooms. Even disease, although diagnosing illness in a skeleton tens of millions of years old, is about as exact as diagnosing sarcasm in a fossilized smile. But what makes these Wyoming bone beds especially confounding is that they're not consistent. In one site, you might find a large grouping of herbivorous dinosaurs, Edmontosaurus, Triceratops, or Camptosaurus, collapsed in mass, as if caught mid-migration. In another, a bizarre mix, carnivores with shattered bones, scavengers with half-eaten prey, all locked in the same sedimentary tomb. Take the Hansen Ranch site in the Lance Formation, for instance. It holds the remains of potentially hundreds of hadrosaurs, mostly Edmontosaurus, piled together in a single Cretaceous bone bed. The sediment around them suggests rapid burial, as if they were overtaken by a sudden flood or mudslide. But here's the issue. Some of the bones show signs of weathering, as if they were exposed for days or even weeks before burial. Others are pristine. So, what happened? Did some members of the herd die first, their bodies left exposed as the rest lingered nearby? Did a drought kill off many of them, followed by a sudden rainstorm that buried what was left? Or was it more episodic, multiple events over weeks or months, preserving the illusion of a single catastrophic moment? Each explanation feels plausible. Each one has problems. The Komo Bluff site, one of the most famous fossil localities in the world, presents another paradox. In the late 1800s, paleontologists unearthed a staggering number of dinosaur remains from this ridge, including Allosaurus, Diplodocus, Stegosaurus, and others often jumbled together in what were called dinosaur graveyards. But even then, the scientists noticed something odd: the sheer density of bones, often with little evidence of decay or scavenging. It was as if the animals had dropped, been stripped clean by time itself, and then entombed in silence. Modern geologists have tried to explain this through a combination of floodplain dynamics, river channel migration, and seasonal die-offs. The idea is that, in a semi-arid environment, animals might congregate at dwindling water sources during dry seasons, making them vulnerable to disease, dehydration, or sudden flash floods. When the rain finally comes, it overwhelms them. Water rises, sediment moves. The dead are buried. It works until it doesn't. Because some sites show signs of multiple species from different habitats dying together, which doesn't match simple floodplain behavior. Others contain animals at different life stages, juveniles and adults, sometimes separated by a thin layer of sediment, suggesting repeated events, not a single disaster. It's as if nature was running a long experiment in mortality and forgot to label the controls. Then there's the matter of volcanic ash. Some mass deathbeds in Wyoming contain trace evidence of ash layers, a sign that nearby eruptions might have played a role. Volcanic activity can cause immediate death through suffocation, but it can also trigger longer-term ecosystem collapse, poisoned water, dead vegetation, respiratory failure. In this scenario, it's not the eruption that buries the animals, it's the starvation that follows. Others suggest that toxic algal blooms, triggered by temperature shifts or environmental instability, may have rendered water sources deadly, an invisible killer that would have left no trace in bone. In a drought-stricken world, even deadly water is still water. And then there's the unspoken possibility. we're missing something big. A pattern, a piece of the puzzle. Something that doesn't fossilize behavior, migration, instinct, interspecies dynamics that could tie these mass deaths together under a single, elegant explanation. But so far, that explanation remains frustratingly out of reach. What we're left with, then, is a strange kind of anti-closure. Fossils that give us the moment of death, but not the reason. Sites that preserve consequences, but not causes. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful. Because every time we kneel over a Wyoming bone bed, brushing sediment away from a 7.5 million-year-old femur, we're not just uncovering a skeleton, we're confronting the unknowable. The possibility that the past isn't just distant, but deliberately silent. That some events resist resolution not because we haven't looked hard enough, but because they were never meant to be understood in full. And just beyond these chaotic mass graves, something even stranger emerges. Certain animals appear, then vanish, sometimes for no apparent reason, as if responding to forces invisible in both fossil and stone. The mystery isn't just how they died, it's why they ever showed up in Wyoming at all. Why some species are present in Wyoming's fossil record, but missing in adjacent regions. At first glance, evolution seems like it should follow a kind of tidy logic. Species migrate, adapt, and spread across the map like ink in water fluid, continuous and geographically reasonable. But dig into Wyoming's fossil beds, and that neat picture starts to break down. You begin to notice something peculiar. Certain species show up here, in this wind-blown corner of the ancient West, and nowhere else nearby. Not in Colorado, not in Montana, not even in Utah. Just here. This isn't just a matter of incomplete fossil records or spotty preservation. This is a consistent anomaly that has puzzled paleontologists for decades. Why do some animals appear in Wyoming's fossil record and seemingly skip the surrounding regions entirely? How can a species thrive in one location yet leave no trace in the neighboring basins? To put it simply, the bones are playing favorites and no one knows exactly why. Let's take a step back. The fossil record in Wyoming is extraordinarily rich, covering vast stretches of time from the late Precambrian through the age of dinosaurs and into the rise of mammals. We're talking about hundreds of species, massive sauropods like Diplodocus, delicate Eocene primates, ancient amphibians, early horses, birds with teeth, crocodilians that lived in forests. And in many cases, these fossils appear in great abundance. Entire bone beds, fully articulated skeletons, even trace fossils like footprints and burrows. But in puzzling cases, some of these species don't show up in other similarly aged formations just across the border. One example, certain early Eocene mammal species, tiny tree-dwelling primates, early rodent-like creatures, or archaic hoofed animals that appear in Wyoming's Willwood Formation are curiously absent from what should be geologically similar strata in places like Montana's Crazy Mountains Basin or Colorado's Piscience Creek Basin. The formations are roughly contemporaneous, the climates were comparable, the ecosystems, possibly even connected. So, where are the fossils? One theory, taphonomic bias, a fancy way of saying maybe they didn't fossilize well elsewhere. Fossilization is rare and finicky. It depends on sedimentation, pH levels, scavenger activity, erosion, and a dozen other unpredictable factors. Perhaps Wyoming's basin was just better suited for preserving bones during that window of time. A lucky geological fluke. But that theory doesn't quite hold water when you realize that those adjacent regions have plenty of fossils, just not those species. Something else is going on. Another theory, ecological specialization. Maybe those animals weren't as widely distributed as we think. Maybe they were picky, tied to specific microclimates, water sources, or food webs that only existed in the Wyoming basin. Imagine a species of leaf-eating mammal that only thrives on one kind of plant, which only grows in a narrow temperature band, which only exists in a high valley that happened to sit where Wyoming is now. Possible? Absolutely. But still, why just there? A third theory enters the evolutionary mix: geographic barriers. Even shallow differences in elevation, temporary water bodies, or ancient volcanic activity could have formed invisible walls in the prehistoric landscape. A few million years ago, what's now a smooth stretch of prairie might have been an impassable swamp, a highland ridge, or a dried lakebed stretching for miles. To us, it's just topography. To a small, ground-dwelling mammal, it's the edge of the known world. But then things get murky. Because in some cases, we do find the same species in far-off regions, say Wyoming and New Mexico, but not in the states between. How do we explain that? Leapfrogging evolution? A fast-moving migration with minimal fossil traces? It challenges the basic logic of biological spread and forces us to admit something deeply uncomfortable. We don't actually know how animals moved across ancient North America. We have models, we have assumptions, but what the fossil record shows us is movement that is messy, discontinuous, and full of strange absences. Species that should be everywhere are confined to small patches. Others that should be rare show up in ridiculous numbers, and still others appear for a geological heartbeat and vanish never to return. These faunal gaps are more than just academic puzzles. They point to something deeper. The possibility that our understanding of ancient ecosystems is based on a highly curated and biased sample of reality. Nature may have operated on terms that we no longer understand and that can't be reconstructed with stones and bones alone. Even our most sophisticated climate models struggle to reconstruct the fine-grained, local variability of prehistoric ecosystems. What was Wyoming like 55 million years ago? Not in general, but right here, at this creek bend, in this patch of trees. Was it cooler? Wetter? Was there a floodplain that trapped bones while the next basin over remained dry? We can't say. And yet, the fossils persist. They show up in places they shouldn't, in numbers that defy easy explanation, and then vanish before we can ask them anything useful. Which raises a final, poetic possibility. Maybe the absence of a species in a particular region isn't a flaw in the record. Maybe it's a clue. A sign that something dramatic once happened. A barrier rose, a predator moved in, a resource disappeared, or a migration route collapsed. The land changed, the species moved or didn't. And those who stayed behind were the lucky ones, or the last ones. Because after they came and went, Wyoming would once again become a theater for extinctions, migrations, and ecological ghost stories, including the sudden appearance and equally sudden disappearance of entire families of animals. But before we chase that vanishing act, we have to look closer at a different puzzle. When exactly did these species arrive in Wyoming in the first place, and why did they leave so quietly? The appearance and disappearance of certain flora and fauna in specific geologic periods. One of the quietest mysteries in Wyoming's deep past isn't the bones themselves, it's when they show up and when they vanish. It's not the drama of a catastrophic extinction or a sudden evolutionary leap, but something far more unsettling, the slow fade in and fade out of entire species. Like actors walking onto a stage, playing an unknown part, then leaving with no explanation and no encore. If you scan Wyoming's fossil record from the windswept cliffs of the Lance Formation to the swampy impressions of the Green River Formation, you'll start to notice strange windows. Periods when certain plants and animals suddenly appear, thrive for a few million years, then vanish. No evidence of struggle, no mass die-offs, just gone. Let's start with the mammals. Wyoming's Eocene fossil beds, roughly 56 to 34 million years ago, are a paleontologist's goldmine. Here you'll find everything from Hyracotherium, an early ancestor of the horse the size of a small dog, to Notharctus, a lemur-like primate leaping through what used to be dense subtropical forests. There are tapirs, archaic whales, flying lemur relatives, and dozens of other mammals with names as difficult as their survival strategies must have been. And then, one by one, they vanish. Some migrate, some evolve. But many disappear entirely from the fossil record in Wyoming, while similar species persist in other regions. In many cases, there's no global extinction event to blame. No meteor, no volcano, no obvious shift in temperature, just a change in ecological handwriting. The script shifts, the characters leave. The plant life is equally elusive. During the late Paleocene and early Eocene, Wyoming was lush, more rainforest than prairie. Fossilized palms, ferns, and giant sycamores tell of a humid, almost tropical landscape. But by the Oligocene, those warm-weather plants are mostly gone, replaced by grasses and cooler-adapted flora. Trees that once towered now vanish entirely from local records. And again, it's not sudden, it's incremental. Vegetation regimes shift, not with a bang, but a shrug. One layer shows seeds from broad-leafed trees. The next, those seeds are missing. Then the pollen grains start to change, the grasses creep in. By the time we realize what's happening, it already has. So what's causing this quiet rearrangement? One culprit is climate. Not catastrophic warming or cooling, but subtle, long-term climatic oscillations. As Wyoming transitioned from the late Paleocene into the Eocene and beyond, its elevation changed. Mountains rose, inland seas withdrew, global temperatures wobbled. Even small temperature shifts just a few degrees could change which plants thrived, which herbivores followed, and which carnivores, in turn, found themselves without prey. This trophic domino effect means that even without a major extinction event, ecosystems could be entirely reshuffled. A change in rainfall patterns might cause one plant species to die out, which starves the insects that depend on it, which in turn weakens bird populations, and so on. A cascade, slow and invisible, playing out over millennia. Another possible factor? Migration corridors opening and closing over time. Wyoming has always been a kind of crossroads, shaped by mountain uplift, shifting river systems, and inland sea regressions. For a few million years, it may have been a passageway, a biological highway for species moving north, south, east, or west. But then a fault line shifts, a basin fills, a climate belt moves, and the corridor closes. Species that once passed through freely are now cut off. Some thrive in isolation. Others die out. The land changes, and the passengers change with it. And then there's the unsettling truth. We may be seeing only fragments of the story. A species might seem to vanish simply because it moved out of the fossilization zone. Wyoming's rock record is incomplete. Erosion, tectonic activity, and selective preservation mean that huge spans of time and entire ecosystems might be missing from our view. What we think is extinction might just be a paper trail lost to wind and water. Still, some cases defy even that explanation. Take, for example, the intermittent presence of ancient camels and horse ancestors in Wyoming. They appear, disappear, and reappear at different intervals, leaving behind a record that suggests pulses of expansion and retreat, not steady evolution, but fits and starts. The timing sometimes lines up with known climatic shifts, but not always. In some layers, we find hoofprints and dung fossils. In others, nothing. It's as if these animals obeyed an ancient rhythm, moving in and out of the region like the tide, guided by forces we no longer see. This pattern isn't limited to large animals. Fossil insects, fish, and amphibians also demonstrate these strange appearances and disappearances. One moment, the fossil beds are full of a particular beetle species. The next layer up? Gone. Did it die out? Did it move? Or did its absence simply go unrecorded because the sediment wasn't the right kind for preserving chitin? And maybe the most uncomfortable thought, some of these arrivals and exits might not have followed logic at all. Evolution is shaped by randomness. Environmental pressures, yes, but also chance. A change in wind patterns, a genetic mutation, a flood that wipes out a localized population, a pollen source that goes extinct. One thing nudges another, and an entire ecosystem transforms over centuries, leaving only fragments for us to ponder. Today, we study these ghosts in shale and limestone, trying to map the pulse of life through Wyoming's deep time. But with every appearance comes a vanishing. Every fossil find is a reminder of how temporary dominance can be, how a species can own a landscape for 1,000,000 years and then vanish without a trace, leaving only questions behind. And just as the animals moved in response to subtle shifts, so did the people. Because thousands of years later, long after the camels and dog-sized horses were gone, humans walked the same ground and faced a familiar question: where to go when the world changes quietly beneath your feet? Patterns of human habitation in mountainous versus lowland zones through glacial and interglacial cycles. In modern maps, Wyoming is a place of boundaries between prairie and range, basin and crest, dryness and snow. But long before borders and fences, it was already a land of edges. And nowhere are those edges more stark than in the elevation gradient, the ancient and relentless rise from lowland valleys to high-altitude wilderness. For prehistoric humans, that difference was more than geographic. It was existential. Because when the ice came, and it did, again and again, it didn't cover all of Wyoming in white, not entirely. Instead, during the height of the last ice age, the late Pleistocene, around 20,000 years ago, the mountains were buried under glaciers, but the basins and foothills were open, cold, dry, and difficult, but habitable. And when the ice retreated, the mountains opened up again. That's the rhythm, glacial and interglacial, advance and retreat. And what's fascinating isn't just the geological story of ice and melt, but the human response to it. Because the people who lived here didn't simply survive. They adapted to a land that changed shape, temperature, and possibility every few thousand years. Here's the mystery. How did prehistoric human groups use the land differently in high versus low zones during these massive climatic shifts? The archaeological record suggests a pattern, but not a simple one. Let's start low. In the basins and valleys like the Big Horn Basin, the Green River Basin, or the Powder River Plain, we find clear signs of long-term, continuous human occupation: hearths, tools, butchering sites. Occasionally, structures. These zones were more stable during glacial periods, free of ice, though bitterly cold, with megafauna like mammoths and bison providing large-scale hunting opportunities. The terrain was harsh, but consistent. Sites like Sunrise, Hell Gap, and portions of the Arapaho, divided by Lost Creek Corridor, show repeated occupation from at least 13,000 years ago onward. Some may go back farther. But the high elevations, the Alpine basins, glacier-fed valleys, and rocky ridgelines tell a different, quieter story. During full glacial periods, these were mostly off-limits, encased in ice, or simply too cold and unstable to support consistent human life. But in the warmer interglacial periods, particularly during the Holocene climatic optimum around 8,000, 5,000 years ago, humans moved up. And this is where the puzzle begins. We find artifacts, but no permanent structures. Projectile points, stone flakes, bone fragments, even wooden tools preserved in melting ice patches. Sites like High Rise Village in the Wind River Range tell of human presence above 10,000 feet, a place once thought too extreme for prehistoric survival. But they weren't just passing through. They were living there seasonally, perhaps, but with organization, planning, and purpose. So what was the high country to them? Hunting grounds, spiritual retreats, trade routes. The evidence suggests all three. Ancient peoples may have used alpine zones in the summer for big game hunting, particularly of bighorn sheep and elk. They may have followed migratory herds up and down the slopes. And they certainly carried with them materials from lower elevations, suggesting the movement wasn't random, but part of a seasonal circuit. But here's the deeper mystery. Why return to these places, year after year, for thousands of years? Because they did. Sites like High Rise Village show evidence of long-term, repeated use in the same high-elevation shelters over centuries. This implies knowledge passed down, not just how to get there, but how to survive there. What plants grow when, which trails to follow, where snow lingers longest, where the wind shifts just before a storm. In a way, it's a kind of prehistoric mountain literacy, an intimate fluency in Alpine life that most modern humans can't even imagine, let alone replicate. But then, the pattern breaks again. As the climate cooled in the late Holocene roughly 3,000 years ago, the evidence for alpine habitation thins out. The glaciers began to grow again. The weather turned. Human presence in the high country retreated. Lowland zones became the focus once more. Permanent settlements shifted. Trade routes adapted. This ebb and flow isn't just a geographic pattern. It's a cultural rhythm. People moved with the land, not against it. They didn't just endure change, they anticipated it, responded to it, folded it into their way of life. The land was never static, neither were they. And that's perhaps the most humbling insight. When faced with massive environmental change, prehistoric humans didn't build walls or cling to single locations. They got up, they moved, they adapted, they let go, and they remembered. Because while few permanent structures remain in the high country, the memory of use persisted across generations. Trails were reused, seasonal camps were revisited. The mountains became a living archive, a place where tradition, survival, and adaptation were written not in books, but in footsteps. And as we look at these patterns now, from melting ice patches, revealing forgotten tools, to carbon-dated hearths in wind-sheltered basins, we're left with a tantalizing question. If these people could live in such dynamic harmony with a changing climate, what have we forgotten? And if we look closer, we might find that some of their tools, their stories, and even their footprints were preserved not in caves or soil, but in the rock faces themselves etched into stone, staring out across the plains in symbols we still can't read. Unexplained artifacts with unclear cultural attribution. Somewhere between the known and the guessed at, between hard data and cultural rumor, Wyoming hides a third category of human legacy: the unexplained artifacts. Not strange in a science fiction sense, no crystal skulls, no ancient batteries, but strange in the archaeological sense. Items that resist clean categorization. Pieces of worked stone, carved rock art, structural remains, or even entire artifact assemblages that don't quite match the known cultural timelines, styles, or distributions we've come to expect from the region. These artifacts aren't dramatic. They're quiet anomalies, the kind of things that get put in the miscellaneous box of the museum drawer. But when you zoom out, when you start lining up these misfits from site to site, a pattern begins to emerge, a pattern of confusion, of cultural noise in the archaeological record. And nowhere is that more evident than in Wyoming. Let's start with the rock art. Wyoming is full of petroglyphs etched into canyon walls, sandstone boulders, and sheltered overhangs. Some are well documented, attributed to the Plains tribes, Shoshonean peoples, or earlier archaic groups. Styles like the Dinwiddie tradition, spindly humanoid figures with internal designs, are familiar, though still only partially understood. But scattered among these recognizable forms are images that don't match any known tradition. They don't share the stylistic conventions. They're carved in unfamiliar ways, using tools that may not align with surrounding technological levels. Some are found far from any known habitation site. Others appear alongside iconography that spans hundreds or thousands of years, suggesting either astonishing cultural continuity or repeated revisiting and recarving by different groups over time. Take the Castle Gardens petroglyphs in Fremont County. They feature elaborate shield-bearing figures, some with surreal faces or hybrid features. Scholars have struggled to pin them down. Are they ceremonial? Are they clan symbols? Are they a fusion of multiple traditions? And who carved them first? We don't know. We have radiocarbon dates from nearby sites. We have ethnographic accounts. We have stylistic comparisons. And still, we don't know. It gets stranger when you realize that some of these carvings predate the people we can comfortably link them to. In a few cases, the carvings appear to have been partially recarved, reused, or repurposed by later groups, turning a single image into a layered palimpsest of cultural input. But who made the first marks? The answer may be a culture we haven't identified yet. And that's not just poetic. It's literal. There are cultural ghosts in the North American archaeological record groups that likely existed, thrived, and dissolved before leaving behind the kind of artifact density modern archaeologists rely on for recognition. These groups may have been transitional, migratory, or simply small. Their tools, if left behind, might resemble those of other groups. Their languages are lost, their symbols misclassified. Their fire pits? Unremarkable. But every once in a while, they show up in the record in the wrong place, at the wrong time. An obsidian projectile point with no local source material. A carved stone figure with stylistic elements from a different continent. A piece of cordage preserved in permafrost that looks nothing like the weaving patterns known from plains tribes. Are these one-offs? Accidents? Or are they threads from a tapestry we've never fully seen? Then there are the tools. Stone tools are typically categorized by shape, size, flaking pattern, and use wear. Wyoming's record includes familiar types: Clovis points, fulsome blades, side-notched dart points, and later arrowheads, associated with the Athabascan and Shoshonean expansions. But a growing number of discovered points, especially those found without clear stratigraphic context, don't fit cleanly into this taxonomy. They resemble Clovis, but aren't. They share features with Dalton or Goshen points, but were found hundreds of miles from the nearest known site of those traditions. These orphaned artifacts complicate the story we like to tell ourselves about migration, contact, and technological spread. They suggest either a broader overlap between cultural groups or something else entirely. The possibility that our typologies are too rigid, that our categories miss the regional experimentation and variability that would have naturally existed among people improvising tools with whatever was at hand. That's the heart of this mystery. What if the artifacts that don't fit aren't exceptions, but the norm? Prehistoric life was not standardized. It was adaptive, dynamic, and probably far more fluid than our archaeological charts can represent. Yet we continue to treat anomalous finds as outliers when they may in fact be telling us that the real story is a lot messier than we're comfortable admitting. And the more Wyoming gives up its stray pieces, misfit carvings, unclassifiable tools, weird burial practices, and ambiguous symbols, the more we begin to see the outlines of lost cultures. People who lived and moved through this region without leaving behind the kinds of neat, layered sites that archaeology prefers. Cultures that were transitional, mobile, and maybe even semi-nomadic in ways that defy our clean cultural chronologies. And this leads to a more unsettling possibility. Perhaps the greatest mystery isn't what we haven't found, but what we've already found and misunderstood completely. Because sometimes, an artifact doesn't belong to the known world simply because it's a remnant of a story we've never been told. And that story might just begin with a whisper carved into stone. One that points toward legends, oral traditions, and folklore that survived far longer than the cultures that made them. Relationship between folklore, oral traditions, and physical archaeological finds. If you want to see a historian sweat, hand them a local legend and ask them to prove it. If you want to see an archaeologist really lose sleep, hand them a matching artifact, something that appears to connect, however faintly, with the impossible story. In Wyoming, the lines between folklore and fact are drawn in dust, and they blur just as quickly. This isn't just a problem of interpretation, it's a foundational dilemma in the study of prehistory. Long before carbon dating and stratigraphy, before museums and academic consensus, the only archives were stories. Stories about beings too small to be seen, too powerful to be doubted, about mountains that weren't always quiet and people who weren't always alone. And then someone finds a mummy in a cave. The Pedro Mountain mummy is a famous case, discovered in the 1,930 seconds in the San Pedro Mountains, the remains were tiny, no more than a foot tall in seated posture. The body was incredibly well preserved, the skull oddly shaped, and the origin quickly became a battleground. Was it an infant with a congenital disorder? A naturally mummified adult of unusually small stature? Or, as local Shoshone and Crow oral traditions suggested, was this the physical evidence of a race of little people, sometimes called Nimerigar, who once lived in the mountains? The mainstream scientific response was predictable. Likely human remains, probably pathological, possibly misidentified. The folklore, meanwhile, tells of tiny warrior-like beings who used poison-tipped arrows, lived in the high country, and were both revered and feared. Myths? Probably. But how do you explain the uncanny alignment between a body no one expected to find and stories that predate its discovery by hundreds, if not thousands of years? That's the tension. The physical and the mythical, overlapping and neither side blinking first. Wyoming has more than its fair share of these overlaps. Petroglyphs depicting humanoid figures with oversized heads, short limbs, and postures suggesting either deformity or exaggeration appear across sites like Legend Rock, Castle Gardens, and White Mountain. Are they spiritual representations? Stylized ancestors? Or literal depictions of something once seen, then remembered, then ritualized? Here's what makes it murkier. In many indigenous traditions, literal and symbolic are not opposites. Stories aren't meant to be either factual or fictional. They're meant to carry meaning, sometimes across centuries, shaped by metaphor and memory both. That makes them notoriously hard to prove with Western academic tools. But it doesn't make them wrong. In fact, some researchers now argue that dismissing oral traditions has cost archaeology dearly. In several cases, legends once considered laughable later led to real discoveries, ancient trade routes, seasonal camps, unusual geological features, and even long-lost water sources. The stories, it turns out, were often maps in disguise. And perhaps that's what the legends of little people are too. Cultural maps of a world that no longer exists. There are many forms these beings take across North American tribal traditions. The Shoshone speak of the Nimerigar, the Crow tell of similar mountain dwellers. Even the Arapaho and Ute have variants, small figures, sometimes magical, sometimes dangerous, often dwelling in liminal places, caves, ridgelines, remote springs, always out of reach, always remembered. These stories echo across thousands of miles and dozens of cultures. Are they archetypes? Echoes of shared mythological frameworks? Or are they distorted memories of actual encounters with human groups that were real, small in stature or number, and eventually forgotten by history? Anthropologists have proposed that some of these myths might reflect encounters with isolated populations, possibly suffering from genetic bottlenecks that produced unusual physical traits. Small stature, cranial deformities, and other anomalies can appear in isolated groups, especially over generations. If such a group existed cut off in a mountain basin, living in harsh conditions, might their memory survive in folklore long after their bodies disappeared? And what if we've already found traces of them, but dismissed them as misfits, deformities, or accidents of preservation? The Pedro mummy's whereabouts are now unknown. Passed from collector to collector, it vanished decades ago. All that remains are photographs, secondhand accounts, and the unease of a question that never got an answer. Was it a hoax, a fluke, or proof that some stories aren't just metaphor? That unease is mirrored in other discoveries. Tiny tools found high in the Wind River Range, bone fragments that don't match local expectations. Petroglyphs, with figures that suggest a body shape rarely seen in Plains iconography. Nothing definitive, just whispers. And then there's the broader pattern. Again and again, Wyoming's ancient artifacts hint at cultural presences that weren't supposed to be here. A trade bead where no trade route should exist. A carving that predates its attributed style. A burial posture that doesn't match the known tradition. Are these evidence of overlooked groups, forgotten cultures who passed through, settled briefly, or lived quietly in parallel to the dominant narratives? Or are they remnants of a past so thoroughly obscured by time that only the stories remain intact? The archaeologist wants a shard of pottery. The storyteller offers a warning. There used to be people in those mountains. Small ones. Quick. You wouldn't see them unless they let you. And sometimes, even then, you still wouldn't believe it. But if even a single story carries a grain of truth, then there may be others. Real bodies, real tools, real camps, hidden still. And just beyond the ridgeline, where science begins to look less certain, the trails of those forgotten people might intersect with the ones we already know. The sunrise site, the camps by the river, the ancient hearths lost to time. But that's a different kind of mystery. Because sometimes, it's not what you find, but what you can't find, no matter how hard you look, that says the most. Where the main camps are at certain early artifact sites. There are many ways to be haunted by a place. Sometimes it's a whisper in the wind or a name etched into stone. Other times, it's the overwhelming presence of absence. The sense that something important happened here, that people lived here, laughed here, died here, but no one remembers where. Wyoming is full of such places. They are not ghost towns. They are ghost camps, prehistoric and invisible, suspected only through the scattered residue of a life that refuses to be pinned down. Take the Sunrise Paleoindian site, for example. It's one of Wyoming's most enigmatic archaeological zones, littered with flakes, projectile points, and ancient tools. Radiocarbon dating has confirmed human activity as early as 14,000 years ago, possibly predating the famous Clovis culture. It's a tantalizing clue in the story of early North American migration. And yet, for all the surface material, no one can find the actual camp. Not a hearth, not a shelter, not a burial, just the debris, the byproducts of life without the life itself. Archaeologists refer to this problem as the site without context dilemma, artifact-rich zones that clearly indicate human presence, but where the actual habitation structures are missing. It's like finding a workshop, but no house, a factory, but no village. Something important happened here, but what, exactly, and where, remains unknown. One reason for this is later disturbance. The Sunrise area, for example, was heavily mined during the 20th century. Entire hills were moved, sediment layers were shuffled. What might have once been a coherent prehistoric landscape is now a geological jigsaw puzzle. Some of its most critical pieces, long gone. You might be standing on the ancient campfire of the first Americans, but if a bulldozer passed over it in 1957, good luck finding charcoal. But even in less disturbed sites, the pattern persists. Scattered tools, stone flakes, and worked bone appear across multiple early Paleoindian sites in Wyoming, including the Powers II Red Ochre Quarry and areas near Hell Gap. We know they were here. We just don't know where they slept. So, where were the camps? One theory is that these early peoples were highly mobile, only stopping in certain areas briefly, leaving behind production zones, places where stone tools were manufactured and cached but not necessarily lived in. The camp, in this view, may have been a few ridges over, lost in areas archaeologists haven't surveyed or where preservation conditions were poor. Another theory suggests that their dwellings were made from organic materials that didn't survive: wood, hide, grass, bone. If those structures weren't protected by sediment buried by floods or rockfall, they would vanish entirely within a few centuries, let alone thousands of years. And yet, that explanation feels a little too convenient. Some researchers propose a more radical idea. Perhaps our modern conception of a camp is too rigid. We imagine defined spaces, circular dwellings, centralized hearths, trash pits. But what if early humans organized space very differently? What if camps were diffuse, spread out in a way that left no single concentrated archaeological signature, but rather a mosaic? What if we've been looking for villages, when we should have been looking for ecosystems of movement? In that view, A camp might have included a butchering area by the creek, a sleeping spot under a rock shelf, a stone flaking zone in a wind-sheltered pocket, and a ritual ochre site up on the ridge. Separated by hundreds of yards, individually each feature looks unremarkable, but together they tell the story of a complex, adaptive human landscape, one that doesn't fit the clean categories we crave. It's not that the camps aren't there, it's that they're not where we expected them to be, and maybe never were. This leaves us with a landscape of suggestion, not confirmation. A world inferred from fragments. And that's the emotional core of the mystery, the deep human urge to know not just that someone lived here, but how they lived here, what they saw, what they feared, what stories they told as the stars spun over the Wyoming plains, 14,000 years before anyone called it Wyoming. Instead, we're left with the leftovers of a life without the life. And in those spaces between what is found and what is missing, a strange possibility rises, that some of the earliest Americans lived lives too flexible, too ephemeral, too wild to ever leave a permanent footprint. Or perhaps they left one, we just haven't learned how to see it yet. And as the search continues, it bleeds into a deeper archaeological paradox. Sometimes, the closer you get to early human presence, the more the trail goes cold. And in other sites not so far away, the trail isn't cold at all. In fact, it's too warm, suspiciously warm, almost impossibly well preserved. Preservation of perishable materials. In archaeology, there are two main kinds of artifacts: those that want to be found, and those that fight you every step of the way. Stone tools, bones, and ceramics? They're the hardy survivors, the stuff of textbooks and museums. They age well, fossilize with dignity, and give clean, measurable data. But then there's the delicate stuff: wood, hide, feathers, plant fiber, hair, rope, cloth, netting, food. All the organic materials that made up the fabric of ancient life literally and figuratively. In most cases, these items vanish into soil and time, consumed by moisture, bacteria, and temperature. But not always. Sometimes, rarely, the earth protects instead of destroys, and when it does, it reveals pieces of human history so shockingly fragile they seem out of place in deep time. And Wyoming, perhaps more than it should, has these moment sites where perishable materials survived in conditions that should have erased them. Mummy Cave, for instance, tucked away in the Absaroka Mountains near the North Fork of the Shoshone River, produced not just stone tools and bones, but fragments of hide clothing, woven fiber, and even wooden artifacts preserved in the dry cave sediments across more than 9,000 years of occupation. It's one of the longest and most continuous records of human life in the region. But the real wonder isn't how much was there, it's how little was lost. These are the anomalies that confuse neat narratives. When preservation is this good, it tells us not just what people did, but how they lived, down to the stitching. Yet, for every mummy cave, there are hundreds of other sites where only stone survives. So what made the difference? The key is a combination of moisture control, temperature stability, and lack of biological activity. Caves are ideal. So are ice patches, now melting across Wyoming's high country due to climate change, and revealing their secrets. In recent years, melting alpine snowfields have exposed wooden dart shafts, hide wrappings, and even ancient sandals. These were left behind, possibly lost by prehistoric hunters, frozen in time literally. The freeze-thaw cycle preserved them far beyond their normal lifespan. Now, as the ice recedes, the past re-emerges but only briefly. Once exposed, these artifacts begin to degrade within days. The tragedy is that we may be finding these just as we're losing them. And the deeper question is why some regions seem to defy entropy more than others. Why does one shelter produce 5,000-year-old twine, while another equally old offers nothing but chipped stone? The answer may lie in small, invisible differences. The angle of a rock ledge, the chemistry of the soil, the temperature swings over millennia. In short, luck. And that's what makes these sites so important. They're not just windows into the past, they're exceptions to the rule of loss. They offer us a rare glimpse into what prehistoric life actually looked like, not just what it left behind. But this also reframes everything else. Because now we know. The people who lived in Wyoming for millennia weren't just stone tool makers and bison hunters. They were weavers, carvers, woodworkers, clothing makers, and more. Their lives were soft as well as hard. Their tools were perishable, and so were their stories. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not what these materials reveal, but what was never meant to last. Because if this much survived by accident, what was lost by design? And if some memories were entrusted to stone, while others were carried in fiber, flesh, and flame, then what happens to a culture when the wind takes its library? Only the soil knows. But even the soil gets confused, especially when dating those memories becomes an unsolvable mess. Dating uncertainties. If time is the thread that holds archaeology together, then stratigraphy is the stitching. Layer by layer, it tells the story. This happened first, that happened later. This one is older than that one. It's the geological equivalent of a library shelf, until someone comes along and knocks all the books over. Welcome to the world of dating uncertainties, and in Wyoming, the shelf is particularly messy. You'd think that after decades of radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, thermoluminescence, and even obsidian hydration analysis, we'd have a fairly precise idea of who was where and when. But in many of Wyoming's prehistoric and paleoarchaeological sites, the timeline reads less like a calendar and more like a jigsaw puzzle someone threw into a windstorm. Let's return to the Sunrise site, a case study in confusion. On paper, it's a dream. Paleoindian tools, ochre mining activity, evidence of long-term human presence. But archaeologists can't agree on how old the earliest layers really are. That's partly because much of the site was disturbed by industrial activity. Historical mining, heavy equipment, and careless excavation didn't just rearrange dirt, they rearranged time. Layers that once sat neatly atop one another were churned and twisted. Contexts were lost. This problem isn't unique to Sunrise. Throughout Wyoming, many early sites suffer from secondary disturbance by humans, animals, erosion, or all three. Rodents burrowing through sediment layers mix older material with newer. Tree roots slice through ancient occupation zones. Floodwaters rearrange artifacts like a lazy curator throwing artifacts into random bins. And then we come along, trying to reassemble the crime scene with tools that were never meant for chaos. Radiocarbon dating helps, but only when you can isolate undisturbed organic material, a burned bone, a bit of charcoal, a piece of wood that can be confidently associated with a specific activity layer. But if that piece of charcoal came from a campfire 300 years later, sitting on top of an earlier stone tool scatter, the date you get is wrong by centuries or more. Even worse, some layers suffer from what's called stratigraphic inversion when younger material ends up beneath older material due to natural processes. A collapsed roof, a slumping slope, or a careless mammal can turn the entire sequence upside down. You date what you think is the earliest occupation, only to find it's from the late Holocene, not the Pleistocene. Congratulations, you've just built a time machine that only goes backwards. And then there are the sites that yield anomalous dates, ones that don't match the surrounding evidence, a tool that seems 2,000 years older than the cultural style it represents. A bone dated to a period before humans were even supposed to be in the region. What do you do with that? Toss it as contamination, or keep it, quietly, in a folder labeled probably a fluke? Some archaeologists argue that we over-rely on radiocarbon dating, treating it like a magical truth machine. But the results depend heavily on the quality of the sample, the calibration curve used, and the assumptions built into the model. Dates are estimates, not timestamps. And when you're working with the faint residue of lives lived 10,000 years ago, even a 100-year error can distort everything. This dating ambiguity doesn't just frustrate academics, it reshapes the narratives. A site thought to represent one culture might actually belong to another. A presumed migration pattern might be a misreading of poorly layered deposits. A tool type might have been in use far longer or shorter than previously believed. In Wyoming, this is especially true in regions where multiple cultures overlapped. Clovis, Folsom, Cody Complex, Plano, and later archaic groups all left traces here. But distinguishing them depends on knowing when the layers formed and when the layers lie to you. The whole house of cards wobbles. This is why archaeologists sometimes sound like conspiracy theorists. Not because they're inventing stories, but because the evidence is genuinely weird and the clock is broken. And so, we return again to the question that lingers beneath every excavation in the state. What if we're wrong not about what happened, but when it happened? Because the moment you lose time, you lose causality. And when that happens, even the best archaeological story becomes just a stack of disconnected scenes, out of order, out of sync, and stripped of meaning. But perhaps the most telling sign of all is what the Earth refuses to tell us. Like how the animals and plants of Wyoming's past thrived in climates we don't fully understand, and how the environmental conditions themselves may have held secrets far more confusing than the tools buried within them. Environmental reconstructions. Dig deep enough into Wyoming's fossil beds, and you start to notice something strange, not just in what's preserved, but in what the preservation implies. A crocodile fossil in the Green River Formation, palm fronds in what's now a wind-blown semi-desert, ancient fish in strata that sit hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The implication is simple. Wyoming didn't always look like Wyoming. But that's where the simplicity ends. Because while we can say with some confidence that the region has swung wildly between subtropical swamp, arid plain, alpine tundra, and back again, the details remain maddeningly elusive. We know the broad strokes. The question is, what was it actually like to stand there? To breathe the air, hear the animals, walk the landscape? That's where environmental reconstruction comes in. And that's where the mystery begins. Take the Triassic and Jurassic periods. These were times of dinosaurs and vast inland floodplains. The Morrison Formation, for example, is rich with sauropods like Apatosaurus and Diplodocus. But how hot was it exactly? How seasonal? Was it wet year-round or punctuated by long dry spells? How high was the water table? What plants filled the landscape? What kind of cover, if any, did smaller animals rely on? The fossils offer hints. Pollen grains, plant impressions, and carbon isotopes give us pieces. But putting them together is like building a jigsaw puzzle from a handful of damp, torn edges. For many periods, including the early Cenozoic, we're missing key data: precise temperature ranges, seasonal fluctuations, soil chemistry, and long-term vegetation patterns. This uncertainty has real consequences. If we can't reconstruct the environment accurately, we can't understand how animals adapted or why they disappeared. If the climate was drier than we thought, that changes our assumptions about food sources. If it was wetter, perhaps we misunderstood predator-prey dynamics. Maybe entire behaviors were shaped by conditions we've mischaracterized. Even worse, environmental data can be contradictory. One layer might suggest a lush, temperate forest. The next, just a few inches up, shows indicators of drought and fire. Did the climate shift that quickly? Or are we seeing local variation pockets of microclimates that don't match the broader pattern? Wyoming's topography doesn't help. Its elevation gradients mean that even small geographic distances can represent huge ecological differences. One valley might be cold and damp, the next, arid and windswept. So a palm fossil in one spot doesn't mean the whole region was tropical. It means that one basin was, for a while, and then wasn't. This is why paleoecologists are increasingly cautious. They talk about mosaic environments, patchy climates, and ecotonal shifts, which is a technical way of saying it's complicated. And then there's the present-day irony. Climate change is melting ice patches and revealing new artifacts just as it threatens to erase the very data we need to reconstruct the past. The pollen, the ice cores, the subtle chemical signatures in permafrost all are vanishing. We are, quite literally, losing our climate memory at the same time we're beginning to understand how fragile it always was. What remains is a half-told story. We know Wyoming was once lush, then dry, then lush again. We know some animals migrated, others evolved, and some vanished entirely. But the environmental context, the why behind the fossils, is still a blank chapter. And until that chapter is written, every reconstructed ecosystem remains a kind of beautiful lie, almost believable, but not quite. Because as with all things buried deep in Wyoming, the closer you get to the truth, the more the dirt starts to shift under your feet. Behavioral mysteries in extinct species. There is a certain comfort in bones. They are solid, quantifiable. They don't lie, at least not loudly. But if you stare at them long enough, you'll realize something disturbing. They don't tell you how anything lived. They tell you what something was made of, not how it moved through its world. And when it comes to the extinct species of prehistoric Wyoming, that silence is deafening. Because it's not enough to know what animals once lived here. We want to know what they did, how they raised their young, how they hunted or didn't, whether they gathered in herds, fought in pairs, or wandered alone. And sometimes, when we're lucky, the fossil record offers a glimpse. But even then, the behavior hovers just outside the frame, an echo, not a statement. Let's revisit the winter serpents, a fossilized cluster of snakes preserved together, seemingly curled in mutual embrace, dating back around 38 million years. Found in what is now a fossil bed in Wyoming, they offer a rare image, 3 reptiles, fossilized in what appears to be coordinated proximity. Were they hibernating together, seeking warmth in a cold season? Or is it all just coincidence, a pile-up in death misread as companionship in life? Reptiles, especially snakes, aren't known for social behavior, but these fossils suggest a moment of overlap, maybe a seasonal burrow, maybe instinctive huddling, or maybe we're just seeing accidental death mistaken for deliberate life. It wouldn't be the first time. And then there are the herds. In sites like the Hansen Ranch bonebed and others scattered across Wyoming's Mesozoic strata, we find dozens, sometimes hundreds of the same species grouped together, preserved in a single deposit. Often Edmontosaurus, sometimes Camptosaurus, occasionally ceratopsians. They died together, that much is clear. But did they live together? The prevailing theory says yes. These were herding animals, moving in groups, much like modern-day ungulates. There's supporting evidence trackways showing multiple individuals moving in the same direction, nesting sites with juveniles clustered close, and predator species found nearby, possibly following the herd like wolves stalk bison. But even this tidy narrative starts to wobble under scrutiny. Were these permanent herds? Seasonal groups? Did adults migrate separately from juveniles? Were herds led by a matriarch, like elephants? Or did they follow more chaotic, shifting patterns? And were these mass death events the result of natural catastrophes, a flood, a drought? Or were they consequences of behavior? Did the herd move toward danger, not away from it? Even in animals like Ahvai tumbandu iveche, the recently discovered Triassic early dinosaur from Wyoming, chicken-sized, agile, and ancient, the behavior is guesswork. Was it a solitary insectivore? A communal ground runner? Did it vocalize? Was it prey or predator? All we have is the shape, the posture, the context. We don't have the habits, the routine. And that's the great behavioral paradox of extinct species. Bones fossilize, instincts do not. Behavior leaves only indirect traces, nesting sites, wear patterns on teeth, claw marks in fossilized wood. But those clues are fragile and often ambiguous. A worn molar could suggest a diet of gritty vegetation or just old age. A clustered nest could mean parental care or simply a favored terrain. This ambiguity gets even stranger, with species that don't behave like modern analogs. Take the Triassic amphibians from Knobby Knob, giant, gilled, crocodile-like creatures, all fossilized together. Did they live communally? Was their congregation seasonal? Did they exhibit schooling behavior like fish, or were they loners brought together by drought or desperation? Their preservation suggests a moment frozen in time, but was it a normal day or the worst day of their lives? The same goes for insect fossils found in the Green River Formation. Delicate wings and exoskeletons preserved in pristine shale. Dragonflies, beetles, wasps. Some found in pairs. Others found mid-flight, or so it seems. Do these snapshots reveal courtship behavior, swarming, or just the random placement of death in still water? At the heart of it all is the question of intention. Did these creatures make decisions? Have strategies? Did a mother dinosaur worry about her offspring? Did a reptile recognize members of its own group? Did animals form attachments, remember locations, teach each other things? We'll likely never know. And that's not just a scientific frustration, it's a philosophical discomfort, because it forces us to admit the limits of what evidence can show. It confronts us with the realization that most of prehistory is not written in what survived, but in what disappeared completely. And in Wyoming, where fossil beds stretch across entire lifetimes, that absence becomes the most dominant presence of all. Even in the best preserved skeletons, there is no trace of play, no evidence of fear, no fossil of a call or a warning or a song. We see the final pose, not the full story. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: for all our technological advances, all our CT scans and isotopic analysis and computer models, the dead still keep their secrets, quietly, stubbornly, just beneath the surface of stone. And so, with the final bones cataloged, the last dust brushed away, the scientist steps back and asks a question no microscope can answer. What were they really like? And then, uncomfortably, we ask it again, this time, not about the animals, but about the people who found them. Because long after the creatures vanished, others came. They didn't leave fossils, but they did leave markings, stories, art, and songs, things that refused to fossilize but still managed to survive. And that's where we end, where prehistoric mystery meets human myth, where bones and beliefs stare each other down and neither one blinks.